Imagine standing in the sweltering heat of southern Iraq, watching as archaeologists carefully brush away 6,000 years of dirt and sand from a clay tablet that should not exist. The symbols carved into its surface tell a story so impossible, so utterly mind-bending, that most scholars refuse to even acknowledge what it says. But here is what it describes: beings from the sky, descending to earth in ships that moved through the heavens like birds of metal, gods who walked among humans, who taught civilization to primitive hunter-gatherers, who altered the very fabric of human DNA. Now, I want you to consider something that might make you uncomfortable. What if everything you learned in history class was wrong? Not slightly inaccurate, not missing a few details. Completely, fundamentally wrong. What if humanity did not crawl out of caves through millions of years of random evolution? What if we were designed, crafted, engineered by an advanced civilization that came here when Earth was young? This is not science fiction. This is the story written in the oldest texts humanity has ever discovered. And the more we dig, the more evidence we find, the more terrifying the implications become. In 1922, archaeologists working in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia unearthed thousands of clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing. These were not recipes or tax records. These tablets contained detailed accounts of Earth's creation, of wars in the heavens, of genetic experiments conducted in underground laboratories. They spoke of the Anunnaki, which translates directly to those who from heaven to earth came. According to these ancient Sumerian texts, these beings arrived on our planet roughly 450,000 years ago with a singular mission: to mine gold. But here is where it gets strange. Multiple governments have attempted to suppress this research. The Vatican has 80 kilometers of restricted archives that no civilian researcher can access. After the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the Baghdad Museum was systematically looted, not by random thieves, but by people who knew exactly which artifacts to take. Thousands of clay tablets vanished overnight. Tablets that contained star charts, mathematical formulas, and detailed descriptions of our solar system that ancient people should not have possessed. UNESCO quietly discourages deep academic investigation into Anunnaki studies, labeling it pseudoscience before any real examination can take place. Why? What are they afraid we might discover? See, the Anunnaki story does not just challenge our understanding of history, it demolishes it completely. If these ancient texts are even partially accurate, then everything changes. Religion, evolution, human civilization, our entire concept of who we are and where we came from gets thrown out the window. We are not the crown of creation, slowly climbing toward enlightenment through our own efforts. We are the product of genetic engineering, created to be workers, designed to serve masters who came from the stars. And those masters? They might be coming back. Modern astronomers have detected anomalies at the edge of our solar system. Something massive is affecting the orbits of distant objects. Some researchers call it Planet 9. Ancient texts call it NIBIRU, the homeworld of the Anunnaki, a planet with an elliptical orbit that brings it back to our corner of space every 3,600 years. Do the math. When was the last time it came close? Right around the time the great civilizations of the ancient world suddenly collapsed. Coincidence? Look, I know this sounds insane. I know every instinct in your rational mind is screaming that this cannot be real. But before you dismiss this completely, ask yourself one question. How did ancient people who supposedly did not have the wheel manage to move 1,200-ton stones and stack them with laser precision? How did the Sumerians suddenly appear out of nowhere with fully developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, and legal codes, as if someone flipped a switch and turned on civilization? Before we dive deep into this rabbit hole together, I want to be real with you for a second. My name is on a lot of lists for talking about this stuff. Creating content like this is not easy, and it definitely does not make me popular with the establishment. But I believe you deserve to hear the full story, even the parts they do not want you to know. So if you find value in what we are uncovering here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This journey goes deep, and trust me, you will want to follow along as we peel back every layer of this ancient mystery. Your support keeps this research alive and helps us reach more people who are ready to question everything. Now, back to the story. Over the next 3 hours, I am going to show you evidence that will fundamentally alter how you view human history. We are going to examine ancient texts that read like science fiction, but were written thousands of years before science fiction existed. We are going to look at archaeological discoveries that mainstream academia cannot explain. We are going to connect dots between Sumerian mythology, modern genetics, and cutting-edge astronomy. By the time we finish, you will never look at a pyramid the same way. You will never read Genesis without seeing the hidden layers underneath. You will understand why certain knowledge has been locked away, why certain questions are forbidden, and why the truth about our origins has been buried beneath 6,000 years of misdirection. The Anunnaki Empire was real. They were here. They changed us. And understanding what they did, why they left, and what happens when they return might be the most important knowledge humanity has ever been denied. So buckle up, turn off your phone, and get ready to see human history through completely different eyes. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The question is not whether you believe this story. The question is whether you are ready to handle what it means if it is true. So where did they come from? According to the ancient Sumerian texts, particularly those translated by scholar Zecharia Sitchin, the Anunnaki originated from a planet called NIBIRU. Now, before you roll your eyes, understand that the Sumerians had detailed knowledge of our solar system that they absolutely should not have possessed. They knew about Uranus and Neptune, planets that were not officially discovered until the 1700s and 1800s, yet Sumerian star charts from 4,000 years ago show them clearly labeled and positioned correctly. But they did not just know about the planets we recognize today. The Sumerians consistently described our solar system as having 12 major celestial bodies: the Sun, the Moon, and 10 planets. 10 planets. We only recognize 8. So either they were counting wrong, which seems unlikely given their mathematical sophistication, or they knew about planets we have not officially acknowledged yet. One of those planets was NIBIRU. NIBIRU is not just another rock floating in space. According to these ancient accounts, it is massive, roughly 3 to 4 times the size of Earth, with an extremely elliptical orbit that takes approximately 3,600 years to complete. For most of that cycle, NIBIRU is out in the frozen darkness beyond Pluto, so far away that detecting it with current technology would be nearly impossible. But every 3,600 years, it swings back through the inner solar system, passing between Mars and Jupiter, before heading back out into the void. Now here is what makes this absolutely fascinating. Modern astronomers have recently been forced to admit that something big is out there affecting the orbits of objects in the Kuiper Belt. They call it Planet 9 or Planet X, and they have been searching for it since 2014 when anomalies in distant object trajectories became impossible to ignore. The math says there is something out there, something with significant mass. They just cannot find it yet because, according to their calculations, it is in the most distant part of its orbit right now. Sound familiar? But let us go back to the beginning. According to the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation epic based on older Sumerian texts, NIBIRU was not always part of our solar system. It was a rogue planet, wandering through space until it was captured by our sun's gravitational field roughly 4 billion years ago. When NIBIRU entered our solar system, it did not arrive gently. Its path brought it into direct collision with another planet that used to exist between Mars and Jupiter. The Sumerians called this planet Tiamat. The collision between NIBIRU and Tiamat was catastrophic. Imagine 2 planets smashing into each other at cosmic speeds. The impact did not destroy NIBIRU because it was larger and more solid, but Tiamat shattered. Half of Tiamat was pulverized into fragments that became the asteroid belt we see today between Mars and Jupiter. The other half, along with Tiamat's largest moon, was knocked into a new orbit closer to the Sun. That surviving fragment, according to this ancient account, became Earth. Tiamat's moon became our moon. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like pure mythology, but consider this. Earth is the only planet in the inner solar system with a moon proportionally that large. Our moon is abnormally big compared to Earth's size. It does not fit the standard planetary formation models very well, which is why scientists have struggled for decades to explain exactly how we ended up with it. The most accepted theory today is the giant impact hypothesis, which says a Mars-sized object smashed into early Earth, and the debris coalesced into the Moon. Sound familiar? They are describing the same event the Sumerians recorded, just using different words. The Sumerians even drew diagrams showing this collision. They depicted NIBIRU with satellites around it, one of which struck Tiamat. Modern translations of these texts describe the satellite as the north wind or the wind weapon. When astrophysicists model planetary collisions, they describe shock waves and atmospheric disturbances that sound remarkably similar to ancient descriptions of cosmic winds. But here is the real question. How did people without telescopes know any of this? How did they know planets collide? How did they understand orbital mechanics? How did they map outer planets that are invisible to the naked eye? The answer, according to the texts themselves, is simple. The Anunnaki told them, because the Anunnaki witnessed it. They were there. Life on NIBIRU was not easy, despite the planet's size and resources. The problem was the orbit. For most of NIBIRU's 3,600-year cycle, the planet is so far from the Sun that it receives almost no solar radiation. So how did life survive there? According to the texts, NIBIRU generates its own internal heat, probably from radioactive decay in its core and tidal forces from its moons. But even with internal heat, maintaining a stable atmosphere on a planet that spends millennia in the frozen outer solar system is a serious challenge. The Anunnaki solved this problem using gold. Now, this sounds ridiculous until you understand the science. Gold is an incredible reflector of radiation and an excellent conductor. If you could suspend gold particles in a planet's upper atmosphere, they would form a reflective shield, trapping heat and protecting the surface from radiation exposure during the periods when NIBIRU swings close to the Sunday. It is actually not that different from how modern scientists have proposed using atmospheric reflectors to combat climate change on Earth. But there was a problem. NIBIRU's gold reserves were depleting. Natural geological processes were burying existing gold deposits deep underground where they could not be mined efficiently. The Anunnaki faced an existential crisis. Without gold to maintain their atmospheric shield, their civilization would collapse within a few generations. They needed a massive, easily accessible source of gold, and they needed it fast. That is when they looked to Earth. Roughly 450,000 years ago, NIBIRU was in the part of its orbit that brought it relatively close to the inner planets. The Anunnaki had developed space travel technology, probably born from necessity given their planet's extreme orbit. They had already explored Mars and found it barren and geologically dead. But Earth was different. Geological surveys from orbit showed something incredible. Massive gold deposits, relatively close to the surface, in a planet with a breathable atmosphere and abundant water. It was perfect. The first expedition was led by a scientist and engineer named Ea, though he would later be known as Enki in Sumerian texts. Enki was the son of Anu, the king of NIBIRU, but he was not the heir. That honor went to his younger half-brother Enlil, who was born to Anu's official queen, while Enki was the son of a concubine. This family dynamic would later become incredibly important and lead to conflicts that shaped human civilization, but we will get to that. Enki splashed down in what is now the Persian Gulf, with a team of 50 Anunnaki. The location was not random. Geological surveys had indicated significant gold deposits in southern Africa, and the Persian Gulf region provided a perfect staging area with access to both water routes and land corridors. They called their first settlement Eridu, which means home in the faraway built. And here is the thing. Eridu exists. Archaeologists have excavated it. It is real. And radiocarbon dating places the earliest settlement layers at roughly 7,000 years ago, which means it was continuously occupied for thousands of years before that, but the older layers have eroded or been built over. The first missions were purely exploratory and extractive. The Anunnaki were not colonizers in the traditional sense. They were mining engineers on a limited contract. The plan was simple. Establish a base, extract as much gold as possible, ship it back to NIBIRU during the next orbital pass, and repeat the cycle. They expected this would be a temporary operation, maybe a few thousand years at most, until NIBIRU's atmospheric crisis was resolved. But it did not work out that way. The problem was scale. The amount of gold needed was staggering. Far more than 50 or even 500 individuals could extract using manual methods. They needed a massive workforce, and they needed it fast. Initially, they recruited more Anunnaki from NIBIRU. Lower-ranking workers, called the Igigi, were sent to Earth to do the heavy mining work, while the elite Anunnaki, numbering around 300, managed operations and lived in relative comfort. But even this was not enough. And the Igigi did not sign up to be slaves working in brutal conditions in deep mines in southern Africa. Resentment grew. The working conditions were horrific. Remember, these were mines going down hundreds of feet, with primitive equipment by modern standards, in sweltering heat. The Igigi were engineers and technicians, not manual laborers. They felt betrayed, lied to, exploited by their own leadership. And then, after nearly 200,000 years of this back-breaking labor, something snapped. The Igigi rebellion was not a small protest. It was a full-scale worker uprising. According to the texts, they burned their tools and surrounded the residents of Enlil, who by this point had arrived on Earth to take command of the operation. Enlil was furious. He wanted to suppress the rebellion with force, to punish the rebels and reassert control. But his father Anu, communicating from NIBIRU, recognized the reality of the situation. You cannot force people to work efficiently at gunpoint, especially when those people have access to advanced technology. The operation needed willing workers, or it would fail completely. That is when Enki proposed something radical, something that would change everything. He suggested creating a new species, a primitive worker who could handle the physical labor, while the Anunnaki focused on management and engineering. A being intelligent enough to follow instructions and operate tools, but not so intelligent that it would question its purpose or rebel against its creators. They would create humanity. Let me paint you a picture of what Earth looked like 450,000 years ago. No cities, no farms, no humans. Just endless wilderness, vast forests, and roaming megafauna that would make modern elephants look like house cats. And into this pristine, untouched world came the Anunnaki with a singular mission: extract gold, lots of it, as fast as possible. The operation they established was not some small-scale prospecting venture. This was industrial mining on a scale that would not be matched on Earth again until the 20th century. The Anunnaki set up a network of interconnected facilities that spanned thousands of miles, each serving a specific purpose in the extraction and processing chain. Eridu, that first landing site in the Persian Gulf region, became the administrative headquarters. This was where Enki established his base of operations, where incoming supplies from NIBIRU were received, and where the refined gold was stored before shipment. But Eridu was just the beginning. They needed more infrastructure, more bases, more coordination points. Within a few thousand years, they had established a series of cities, each one positioned with mathematical precision. Nippur became the mission control center, literally. The Sumerians called it the navel of the earth. And here is why that matters. Nippur sits at exactly the geographical center of the land masses they were working with. If you draw lines from Nippur to the other major Anunnaki settlements, they form geometric patterns based on the golden ratio. Ancient city planning, random coincidence, or precise engineering by beings who understood advanced mathematics and surveying. Then there was Lhasa, Sippar, Shurapak. Each city had a specific function in the operation. Some were way stations for transporting ore from the mines. Others were processing facilities. The entire southern Mesopotamian plain became a massive industrial complex, disguised as ceremonial centers. At least that is how archaeologists interpret the ruins today. But the real action, the brutal heart of this operation, was happening thousands of miles away in southern Africa. The main mining operations were concentrated in what is now Zimbabwe, South Africa, and neighboring regions. And before you dismiss this as fantasy, understand that southern Africa contains some of the richest gold deposits on the entire planet. The Witwatersrand Basin in South Africa alone contains nearly half of all the gold ever mined in human history. But here is what makes it weird. Archaeologists have discovered ancient mining operations in these regions that date back over 100,000 years, possibly much older. These are not simple surface deposits where you pick nuggets off the ground. These are deep shaft mines, going down hundreds of feet, with evidence of advanced engineering techniques, ventilation shafts, support structures, systematic extraction patterns. Mining on this scale requires organization, planning, and a workforce that understands complex engineering principles. So who dug these mines? The official story is that early humans must have done it, despite the fact that according to mainstream archaeology, humans at that time were barely making stone tools and living in small hunter-gatherer bands. The idea that they suddenly organized massive mining operations and then forgot how to do it for another 90,000 years, that does not add up. But if the Anunnaki were running these operations with the Igigi workforce, suddenly it makes sense. You have an advanced civilization with the technology and knowledge to identify ore deposits, sink deep shafts, and extract minerals efficiently. They had the motivation, the means, and the manpower. At least, they had the manpower initially. The Igigi were brought to Earth under what we might today call false pretenses. They were told this would be a prestigious assignment, a chance to serve the home world, to be part of a crucial mission. The recruitment materials probably painted it as an adventure, an opportunity to explore a new planet. What they got was something very different. Imagine being sent to a foreign world, far from everything you know, and being told your job is to go deep underground in sweltering heat and hack away at rock face for 12-hour shifts, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. Because here is the thing, time moved differently for this operation. The Anunnaki lived extraordinarily long lives, compared to what we consider normal. The Sumerian king list describes individual rulers reigning for thousands of years, and while scholars dismiss this as mythological exaggeration, what if it is not? What if their biology evolved on a planet with a 3,600-year orbit, simply aged more slowly than ours? So the Igigi were not working for a few years before retirement. They were working for millennia. They watched generations of their people born into this labor, living their entire lives in the mines, dying in the mines. The gold flowed back to NIBIRU. The atmospheric shield was maintained. The elite Anunnaki on Earth lived in comfort and luxury. But the Igigi? They got nothing but broken bodies and broken spirits. The conditions were unspeakable. Deep underground, the heat was intense, probably over 100 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity that made breathing difficult. The tools, while advanced by our standards, were still inadequate for the scale of work required. Rockfalls killed workers regularly. Flooding was a constant danger. Toxic gases accumulated in poorly ventilated shafts. And for what? So that royalty on a distant planet could maintain their lifestyle. Resentment built slowly at first. Whispered conversations in the dark between exhausted workers. But resentment has a way of crystallizing into anger when people realize their suffering is not necessary. It is just convenient for those in power. The breaking point came after roughly 200,000 years of continuous operation. 200,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. That is longer than modern humans have existed. But for the long-lived Anunnaki, it might have represented only a few dozen generations of workers. Still, it was long enough for the Igigi to reach their absolute limit. The rebellion did not start with violence. It started with a work stoppage. One day, the Igigi simply put down their tools and walked out of the mines. All of them, simultaneously. This was coordinated, planned, organized. They were not just throwing a tantrum. This was a calculated labor strike designed to bring the entire operation to a grinding halt. And it worked. Without the Igigi mining gold, the whole system collapsed. Processing facilities sat idle, transport routes backed up, warehouses emptied. And most critically, the next shipment to NIBIRU was in jeopardy. This was not just an operational inconvenience. This was an existential threat to everyone on the home world. Enlil, who by this time had assumed command of the Earth mission, was absolutely livid. In his mind, this was mutiny, insubordination of the highest order. He believed in hierarchy, in duty, in the absolute authority of leadership. To him, the Igigi had violated the most sacred principles of their society. His solution was simple and brutal. Crush the rebellion with military force, execute the ringleaders, and terrorize the rest back into submission. But Enlil was not the only authority on Earth. His half-brother Enki, the chief scientist and engineer, saw the situation differently. Enki was more pragmatic, more willing to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. And the reality was this: forcing unwilling workers to perform complex technical tasks in dangerous conditions is a recipe for disaster. Sabotage, accidents, inefficiency. You cannot run a mining operation at gunpoint and expect good results. So Enki called for arbitration. He contacted their father Anu back on NIBIRU and requested a formal hearing. This was a power move that Enlil could not ignore, because even though Enlil was the official heir, Anu was still the ultimate authority. If Anu sided with the Igigi or proposed a compromise, Enlil would have to accept it. Anu agreed to hear testimony from both sides. Representatives of the Igigi were allowed to speak, to describe their working conditions, to explain why they had reached this breaking point, and their testimony was damning. They described the mines as hell beneath the earth. They talked about watching their comrades die, about bodies that gave out decades or centuries before their minds did. They argued that they had fulfilled their duty far beyond what was initially promised, and that continuing was not just unfair but a form of slavery. Anu listened, and then he made his ruling. He acknowledged that the Igigi grievances were legitimate. Their working conditions were indeed intolerable, and forcing them to continue would be wrong. But he also recognized that the gold mining operation could not stop. NIBIRU needed that gold. The atmospheric shield required constant maintenance. Millions of lives on the home world depended on the continued flow of resources from Earth. The Igigi, he declared, would not be forced back into the mines, but the mission would continue. Somehow, they needed to find another way, another workforce that could handle the physical demands without the moral complications of enslaving their own people. That is when Enki presented his proposal, the solution that had probably been forming in his mind for centuries, waiting for the right moment. He told the council about a creature he had observed on Earth, a primitive hominid that already existed here, smart enough to use simple tools, strong enough to handle physical labor, but still primitive, still operating mostly on instinct. Enki called them the beasts of the field. What if, Enki suggested, we could enhance this creature, elevate it just enough to understand complex instructions and perform mining work? We would not be creating something from nothing. We would just be accelerating evolution, guiding it toward a useful outcome. These enhanced beings would not be Anunnaki, so none of the moral concerns about slavery would apply. They would be purpose-built workers, designed from the ground up for this specific task. Enlil hated the idea immediately. Creating a new intelligent species, playing God with the building blocks of life itself. It was dangerous, unpredictable, possibly sacrilegious depending on your interpretation of Anunnaki religious law. And more than that, Enlil did not trust Enki. The two brothers had been rivals their entire lives, competing for authority, for recognition, for their father's approval. Anything Enki proposed, Enlil instinctively opposed. But Anu saw the logic. They had no other options. The Igigi would not go back to the mines voluntarily, and forcing them would likely lead to civil war. They could not import enough new workers from NIBIRU fast enough to maintain production schedules, and abandoning the mission entirely would doom their home world. Creating a new workforce was risky, yes, but it was the only path forward that did not end in catastrophe. So Anu gave his approval. Enki was authorized to proceed with his genetic experiments, to create a being that could serve as the solution to their labor crisis, a being that would be intelligent enough to mine gold, but not so intelligent that it would ask why it was mining gold. They were going to create us, and nothing would ever be the same again. Enki did not waste any time. Once he had authorization from Anu to proceed with his experiments, he immediately began setting up what can only be described as Earth's first biological laboratory. The location he chose was called the Abzu, which translates to deep source or primeval waters. This was not just any facility. According to the texts, the Abzu was in southeastern Africa, built near the mining operations, probably in what is now Zimbabwe or Zambia. It was underground, climate-controlled, and equipped with everything Enki needed for genetic manipulation. Now, before we go further, I need you to understand something important. When ancient texts describe Enki fashioning humans from clay, modern scholars laugh and call it primitive mythology. But what if clay is just the word they used for something else? Clay is primarily composed of silicate minerals, the same basic building blocks that make up cellular structures. DNA itself is partly silicon-based in its sugar-phosphate backbone. What if the ancients were describing genetic engineering using the only vocabulary they had available? When you do not have words for chromosomes and nucleotides, you describe the process using metaphors that your audience will understand. Enki did not work alone. His primary collaborator was a female scientist named Ninhursag, who the Sumerians called the Lady of the Rib, or the Lady who gives life. In later myths, she gets transformed into various mother goddesses across different cultures, but originally she was a geneticist. Her specialty was biology and medicine. Together, Enki and Ninhursag formed the core team that would alter the course of life on this planet. Their starting material was Homo erectus, a hominid species that had already been evolving on Earth for over 1 million years. These creatures walked upright, used basic stone tools, probably had primitive language or communication systems, and showed signs of social organization. They were not stupid animals. They were proto-humans, standing right on the edge of something greater, but lacking that final push to get there. Perfect raw material for what Enki had in mind. The plan was conceptually simple but technically complex. Take the DNA of Homo erectus and splice in genetic material from the Anunnaki themselves. Create a hybrid species that combined the environmental adaptation and physical resilience of Earth hominids with the intelligence and cognitive abilities of the Anunnaki. Not a full 50-50 split, though. More like adding just enough Anunnaki DNA to boost brain function, improve manual dexterity, and enhance learning capacity, while keeping the base organism mostly unchanged. Why not just clone Anunnaki directly? Because full Anunnaki physiology was designed for NIBIRU's environment, not Earth's. The gravity is different. The atmospheric composition is different. The day-night cycle is vastly different. An Anunnaki body on Earth would constantly be fighting against conditions it was not built for, but a mostly human body with Anunnaki cognitive enhancements? That would thrive here while still being smart enough to follow complex instructions. The first attempts were disasters, complete failures. The texts describe malformed creatures that could not survive, beings born with severe defects, experiments that had to be terminated before they suffered needlessly. This was not clean science. This was trial and error on a massive scale, with countless failed prototypes that never made it past the testing phase. But Enki was persistent. He adjusted ratios, modified techniques, tried different combinations of genetic material, and slowly, painfully, he started getting results that could survive. The earliest successful specimens were called Lulu, which means mixed one or one who has been mixed. The texts specifically refer to them as Lulu Amalu, mixed worker, not a compliment, not a term of endearment, a job description. These first-generation hybrids were limited in capability. They could follow simple instructions, perform repetitive physical tasks, and work in coordinated groups, but their cognitive abilities were constrained by design. Enki had deliberately kept their intelligence capped because the whole point was to create workers who would not question their purpose or rebel like the Igigi had. They needed to be smart enough to mine gold efficiently, but not smart enough to ask why they were mining it or what happened to it afterward. There was just one massive problem. These early humans could not reproduce. Enki had created them sterile, either intentionally as a safety measure or accidentally as a side effect of the genetic manipulation process. Either way, it meant that every single worker had to be individually created in the laboratory. This was not sustainable. The whole point of using biological workers instead of the Igigi was to create a self-replenishing labor force. If each specimen had to be custom-made, they might as well have stuck with the original plan. So Enki went back to the drawing board. He needed to figure out how to give these beings reproductive capability without losing control over the population or having them become too independent. This is where the story gets really interesting and starts connecting to mythology that you have definitely heard before. According to the texts, Enki eventually succeeded in creating a fertile breeding pair. He called them Adamu and Tiamat, though later these names would be corrupted into Adam and Eve in Hebrew tradition. These were not the first humans. Understand. They were the first humans capable of sexual reproduction. Enki had effectively turned on the fertility genes that he had previously suppressed or removed. But there was a catch. Turning on reproductive capability required giving these beings more complete biological systems, which meant more complete neurological systems, which meant greater cognitive capacity. Adamu and Tiamat were smarter than the Lulu Amalu, not as smart as the Anunnaki, but smart enough to be curious, smart enough to wonder, smart enough to potentially become a problem. Enlil was furious when he found out what Enki had done. In Enlil's view, Enki had violated the fundamental parameters of the project. They were supposed to create limited workers, not a new intelligent species that could reproduce and spread across the planet. This was dangerous. This was irresponsible. And knowing Enki, this was probably exactly what he intended all along. See, there is evidence in the texts that Enki never fully bought into the idea of creating a slave race. His speeches and actions suggest he saw something more in humanity, some potential that went beyond just being mine workers. Whether this was compassion, scientific curiosity, or long-term strategic thinking is hard to say. Maybe all three. But Enlil suspected, probably correctly, that Enki had his own agenda that went beyond the immediate labor problem. The confrontation between the brothers over this issue is recorded in multiple texts and forms the basis of the Garden of Eden story. Enlil decreed that these enhanced fertile humans should be kept isolated in a controlled environment called the garden or orchard, probably a fenced compound within the Abzu facility. They were to be monitored closely, not allowed to interact with the sterile Lulu Amalu workers or spread their genetics into the general population. They were, in effect, quarantined prototypes. Enki, of course, had other plans. The texts describe him giving Adamu and Tiamat knowledge they were not supposed to have, teaching them things that Enlil had explicitly forbidden. The famous fruit of knowledge was not an apple, it was information, understanding, awareness of their own nature and potential. Enki was upgrading their consciousness even further, pushing them past the safety limits that Enlil wanted to maintain. When Enlil discovered this second violation, he went ballistic. He expelled Adamu and Tiamat from the controlled environment, essentially kicking them out of the laboratory and into the wild. If Enki wanted to create an independent, intelligent species, fine, but they would have to survive on their own without Anunnaki support or resources. It was supposed to be a death sentence. Primitive humans cast out into a hostile world full of predators and dangers, forced to fend for themselves, with no training or preparation. Except they did not die. They survived. They thrived. They reproduced. And their offspring inherited the genetic enhancements that Enki had given them. This is where the timeline gets really interesting. Mainstream archaeology tells us that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. But here is the weird part. For most of that time, we were just another animal species. We had the hardware, the big brains, the vocal cords for complex language, the dexterous hands for tool use, but we did not do anything with it. For 250,000 years, Homo sapiens made the same boring stone tools, lived in the same small nomadic groups, showed no signs of abstract thinking or cultural development. Then, roughly 50,000 years ago, something changed. Suddenly, within a geological eye blink, humans exploded in capability. Art appeared. Music appeared, complex tools appeared, permanent settlements appeared, symbolic thinking appeared. Archaeologists call this the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, and nobody can adequately explain what triggered it. The hardware had been there for 250,000 years, so why did the software suddenly activate? The Anunnaki texts provide an answer. What if that long plateau period was when the sterile Lulu Amelu were the dominant human type, limited by their genetic constraints? And what if the sudden explosion of human capability coincides with when Enki's fertile, enhanced humans began to outnumber and replace the sterile workers? When the genetic lockdowns were removed and human cognitive potential was finally unleashed? But Enki was not done tinkering. The texts describe multiple subsequent modifications to human genetics over thousands of years. Each time, he was trying to push us further, make us more capable, more independent, more similar to the Anunnaki themselves. And each time, Enlil pushed back, trying to maintain control and limit human development. This conflict between the brothers becomes a recurring theme throughout human history, with Enki as humanity's champion and Enlil as our warden. One of the most significant later modifications involved lifespan. Early humans apparently lived much longer than we do today. The biblical patriarchs supposedly lived for hundreds of years, and while that seems impossible now, what if it was accurate? What if the original genetic design included Anunnaki longevity factors? The texts describe a later council decision to limit human lifespan, to reduce our years because long-lived humans were becoming too knowledgeable, too powerful, too much of a potential threat. They literally programmed aging and death into our genetics to keep us controllable. And here is something that should make your skin crawl. We still carry the evidence of this genetic manipulation in our bodies today. The human genome contains vast stretches of so-called junk DNA, genetic sequences that do not seem to code for anything, do not get expressed, just sit there taking up space. About 97% of our genome is categorized as junk, but modern genetic research is discovering that this junk is not random garbage. It is highly organized, contains regulatory sequences, has clear structure and purpose. It just does not get activated under normal circumstances. What if that silent genetic code is leftover programming from our creation? Instructions that were written into our DNA but then turned off or locked away? Capabilities that we are designed to have but are prevented from accessing? Every human alive today is walking around with a genetic library that is 97% unread. What is in there? What were we designed to be before the limiters were put in place? Some researchers have found that certain genetic sequences in human DNA do not match anything else on Earth's evolutionary tree. They appear suddenly in our genome with no clear ancestral lineage. The standard explanation is lateral gene transfer from bacteria or viruses, but that does not fully account for the complexity and organization of these sequences. What if they are not from Earth at all? What if they are literally alien code, spliced in from Anunnaki genetic material? The texts also describe something else fascinating. Not all humans were created equal in this process. The first enhanced fertile humans, the Adamu and Tiamat lineage, were kept relatively pure. Their descendants became what later texts call the bloodline, families that maintained a higher percentage of Anunnaki DNA than the general population. These bloodlines became the ruling classes, the royal families, the priesthoods. They were literally genetically superior for leadership roles, not because of any mystical divine right, but because they were engineered that way. This is why ancient royal families were obsessed with incest, with keeping bloodlines pure. They were not just being weird or superstitious. They were trying to prevent dilution of the Anunnaki genetic heritage that gave them enhanced cognitive abilities, longer lifespans, and greater leadership capacity. When pharaohs married their sisters or cousins, they were practicing genetic conservation to maintain the traits that separated them from common humans who had more diluted Anunnaki DNA. Meanwhile, the masses of Lulu-Amelu workers continued to exist alongside the enhanced humans for thousands of years. Eventually, the two populations interbred enough that the sterile workers disappeared as a distinct group, but you can still see the genetic stratification in modern humanity. Some families, some lineages, carry more of the original Anunnaki enhancements than others. And those families? They still run things today. But we will get to that conspiracy later. The bottom line is this. Humans did not evolve naturally over millions of years through random mutation and selection pressure. We were designed, engineered, purpose-built for a specific task by beings who had mastered genetic manipulation hundreds of thousands of years before we figured out basic agriculture. We are not the crown of creation. We are the product of an ancient corporate mining project. And everything we think we know about our origins, our nature, our potential, it is all built on a foundation of lies designed to hide the truth about what we really are. The question is, why hide it? What are they afraid we might do if we remembered? You want to understand how 300 beings controlled millions, how a handful of extraterrestrials maintained absolute dominion over an entire planet's population for hundreds of thousands of years. The answer is not military might, though they had that. It is not advanced technology, though they had that too. The answer is something far more insidious. They built a system so elegant, so psychologically powerful, that humans policed themselves. They made us worship our own enslavement. But let us start at the top of the pyramid, with the royal family dynamics that shaped everything that happened on Earth. Because this was not some sterile corporate hierarchy. This was a family business, with all the jealousy, betrayal, and dysfunction that implies. Anu was the king of NIBIRU, the supreme ruler whose word was law. Picture him as the distant CEO who rarely visits the branch office, but whose decisions ripple through everything. Anu had multiple wives and consorts, as was apparently standard for Anunnaki royalty, and this created a succession nightmare that would make Game of Thrones look like a children's show. His firstborn son was Enki, brilliant, creative, scientifically minded, born to a consort named Antu. Under normal circumstances, being the eldest should have made Enki the heir apparent. But Anunnaki succession law had a twist. Legitimacy mattered more than birth order. The son born to the official queen, the primary wife, took precedence regardless of age. That son was Enlil, born to Anu's half-sister, which, yes, makes this a product of royal incest breeding, something the Anunnaki apparently practiced to keep their genetics concentrated. So you have Enki, older, smarter, more innovative, but legally illegitimate, and you have Enlil, younger, more rigid, more traditional, but the official heir. This dynamic poisoned their relationship from birth. Every interaction between them was filtered through this fundamental injustice that Enki felt, and Enlil refused to acknowledge. When Anu sent them both to Earth, it was partly to exploit their talents, but also probably to separate them before they tore NIBIRU apart with their rivalry. Enki arrived first, remember, establishing Eridu and running the initial operations. For those early years, he was effectively the governor of Earth, answering only to Anu. He built the infrastructure, designed the systems, explored the planet. Earth was his project, his baby. Then Enlil showed up with his official appointment as Supreme Commander, and suddenly Enki was demoted to Chief Scientist. Everything Enki had built was now under Enlil's authority. You can imagine how well that went over. The texts describe their power-sharing arrangement, but arrangement is too polite a word. It was a cold war. Enlil controlled the official command structure, the military forces, the political authority. His headquarters was Nippur, the administrative center, where he sat like a king dispensing judgments and issuing orders. Enki nominally accepted this arrangement, but maintained his own separate power base in Eridu, controlling the scientific operations, the genetic laboratories, the technological development. Two brothers, two power centers, constantly maneuvering against each other. And here is where it gets complicated. They each had their own children, who became gods in their own right, and those children inherited the family feud. Enlil's sons included Ninurta, a military commander type, and Nanna, who controlled the moon and lunar cycles. Enki's children included Marduk, ambitious and power-hungry, and Ningishzida, who inherited his father's scientific talents. These second-generation Anunnaki were born on Earth, not Nibiru, which meant they saw Earth as their home, their birthright, not some temporary mining colony. They had even less reason to defer to distant authorities back on Nibiru. The Anunnaki established what they called the Council of 12, the major gods who held real power and made collective decisions about Earth's governance. But 12 is not a random number. It corresponds to the 12 houses of the zodiac, which the Anunnaki introduced to humanity. Each of the 12 major gods was assigned rulership over both a geographical region on Earth and a zodiacal constellation in the sky. This was deliberate symbolic reinforcement, tying earthly power to celestial patterns, making their authority seem cosmically ordained rather than just military occupation. Enlil got Taurus, appropriate for the stubborn authoritarian. Enki received Aquarius, the water-bearer, fitting for the one who brought knowledge. Marduk eventually claimed Ares after a particularly nasty power struggle we will discuss later. Each region of Earth fell under one god's jurisdiction, and humans in that region were expected to serve that particular deity exclusively. Not just worship, understand, serve, provide labor, provide resources, provide absolute obedience. This is where the psychological control system came in. The Anunnaki did not just rule humans through force. They made us believe they were gods, capital G, worthy of worship and devotion. They appeared from the sky in flying machines that must have seemed magical to primitive humans. They demonstrated technology that looked like miracles. They lived for thousands of years while humans died in decades. They were taller, stronger, more beautiful than normal humans, probably by design given that they needed to maintain genetic distinction from their hybrid creations. From a human perspective on the ground, what else would you call them except gods? When an Anunnaki arrived in a flying vehicle trailing fire and thunder, when they healed the sick with advanced medicine, when they commanded storms and earthquakes with weather control technology, when they lived generation after generation without aging, how could primitive humans conceptualize them as anything other than divine beings? And the Anunnaki encouraged this misconception. They demanded worship, required temples to be built in their honor, insisted on sacrifices and offerings, not because they were vain, though some certainly were, but because worship is the ultimate control mechanism. When people believe their rulers are gods, they do not rebel. They cannot even conceive of rebellion. To defy a god is to defy the natural order of reality itself. It is not just illegal or dangerous, it is philosophically impossible. Each major god maintained their own city-state as a power base. These were not just ceremonial centers. They were administrative hubs where that particular Anunnaki lived in a ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid that served as palace, temple, and fortress. Humans were allowed in the outer courts to deliver offerings and receive commands, but the inner sanctum was forbidden territory. That is where the Anunnaki actually lived, where they kept their technology, where they communicated with each other and with NIBIRU. The ziggurat design was not aesthetic, it was functional. The higher levels provided landing platforms for their flying craft. The internal chambers housed communication equipment, weapons systems, living quarters, designed for beings much larger than humans. The underground levels connected to tunnel systems that linked multiple ziggurats together, allowing the Anunnaki to travel between cities without being seen by human populations. This network of underground passages is still there, by the way. Ground-penetrating radar has detected massive tunnel systems under many ancient sites, far older than any civilization that supposedly built the structures above them. Each god required human servants, but not just any humans. They established priesthoods, carefully selected bloodlines that carried higher concentrations of Anunnaki DNA. These priestly families became intermediaries between gods and common humans. They learned to read and write when literacy was forbidden to the masses. They learned mathematics and astronomy when such knowledge was considered too dangerous for workers. They were taught the religious rituals that kept human populations compliant and productive. But here is the genius of the system. These priests genuinely believed. They were not cynical manipulators running a scam. They truly thought the Anunnaki were gods deserving of worship. The Anunnaki had created a managerial class that enthusiastically enforced their will without requiring constant supervision. The priests did the day-to-day work of governance, collecting tributes, organizing labor, settling disputes, all while the actual Anunnaki could remain remote and mysterious, only appearing for major decisions or demonstrations of power. This hierarchical structure replicated itself down through every level of society. Kings ruled cities and answered to the gods. Nobles ruled districts and answered to kings. Overseers directed workers and answered to nobles. Everyone had someone above them in the chain of command, stretching ultimately back to the Council of 12 and through them to Anu on Nibiru. It was bureaucratic control disguised as divine order. The Anunnaki also controlled humanity through their monopoly on knowledge. Writing, systems, mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy, medicine, all of these were gifts from the gods, taught to humans gradually and selectively. And here is the key. They never taught us everything. They gave us just enough knowledge to be useful, but not enough to be independent. Agricultural techniques to grow more food, but not enough to question why we were growing it. Metallurgy to smelt bronze and iron, but not the advanced materials science the Anunnaki possessed. Mathematics for accounting and construction, but not the higher dimensional geometry they used for their own engineering. This created permanent dependency. Humans needed the gods because only the gods had access to the higher knowledge that made civilization possible. If the gods withdrew their favor, civilization would collapse. At least, that is what everyone believed. It was the ultimate protection racket. We control the knowledge you need to survive, so you better keep us happy. The military dimension cannot be ignored either. While psychological control was the primary system, the Anunnaki maintained armed forces as backup. These were not large armies of Anunnaki soldiers that would have been impractical given their limited numbers. Instead, they used human auxiliaries, specially trained and equipped warriors, who fought on behalf of their patron deity. When conflicts arose between different Anunnaki factions, and they arose frequently, these human armies clashed while their divine sponsors watched from above. This served multiple purposes. It allowed Anunnaki conflicts to be resolved without risking Anunnaki lives. It gave ambitious humans an outlet for aggression that could be directed toward useful ends. And it reminded the general population that the gods had ultimate destructive power. When your god's human army crushes a neighboring city, it reinforces that this god is powerful, victorious, worthy of continued service. But the real enforcement mechanism was more subtle. The Anunnaki held hostages without anyone realizing they were hostages. They took the most promising human children, especially from the bloodline families, and raised them in the temples. Official story. This was an honor, a chance to serve the gods directly. Reality. It ensured the loyalty of human leadership. Rebel against your god and your children. Living in the ziggurat, suffer the consequences. This was ancient statecraft at its finest. The whole system was designed for stability and longevity. Small conflicts between humans were allowed, even encouraged, because they prevented unified resistance. But anything that threatened the overall power structure was crushed immediately and brutally, with the perpetrators made into examples that would terrify populations for generations. Step too far out of line, and you did not just die. Your entire bloodline was erased. Your city was destroyed. Your very name was stricken from records. The Anunnaki understood that the most effective violence is the kind you rarely have to use because everyone remembers what happened the last time someone tried. For hundreds of thousands of years, this system worked flawlessly. Humanity served, the gold flowed, NIBIRU's atmosphere was maintained, and the Anunnaki Empire continued. It was the most successful colonization operation in history, not through force but through the complete psychological capture of the subject population. We did not just submit to their rule. We loved our rulers, worshipped them, built our entire civilizations around serving their interests. And then something changed. The family drama that had been simmering between Enlil and Enki, between their children and grandchildren, finally boiled over into open warfare. And when gods go to war, entire civilizations burn. Walk into any museum with Egyptian artifacts, and you will see tools that make no sense. Granite vases carved with impossible precision, their interiors perfectly hollowed with walls so thin they are translucent. Diorite statues polished to a mirror finish, even though diorite is one of the hardest stones on Earth, harder than the copper and bronze tools Egyptians supposedly used. Hieroglyphs cut into solid granite with edges so sharp and clean they look like they were machined yesterday, not carved 5,000 years ago with primitive chisels. The official explanation? Patience and elbow grease. Thousands of workers spending decades rubbing stones together. Except anyone who has actually tried to replicate these artifacts using ancient methods quickly discovers it is impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. Modern stonemasons with diamond-tipped power tools struggle to match the precision of work attributed to people banging rocks together. So either ancient humans had technology we cannot even replicate today with all our advantages, or someone else made these things. Someone with capabilities far beyond what mainstream history wants to admit. Let us start with the pyramids because everyone thinks they understand pyramids. Tombs for pharaohs, right? Monuments to ego built by slave labor? Wrong on every count. The Great Pyramid of Giza was never a tomb. No mummy has ever been found there. No hieroglyphs decorating the walls like every other Egyptian tomb. No treasure. No inscription claiming which pharaoh built it. Instead, what you find inside are features that make sense only if you understand it as a machine, not a monument. The internal chambers are arranged with mathematical precision that encodes advanced physics. The king's chamber sits at exactly 1/3 of the pyramid's height, positioned on the golden ratio. The shaft angles pointing from this chamber align perfectly with specific stars, not as they appeared when Egyptologists claim it was built, but as they appeared in 10,500 BC. The granite blocks forming the chamber walls contain high concentrations of quartz crystal, which has piezoelectric properties, meaning it generates electrical charge when subjected to pressure or vibration. Now, ask yourself why you would build a tomb with piezoelectric materials unless you were doing something involving electricity. The entire structure sits on an underground aquifer, water flowing through limestone caverns directly beneath the pyramid. Water moving through stone generates small electrical currents. Quartz crystals in the granite blocks under pressure from millions of tons of stone above. They would resonate. They would vibrate at specific frequencies. They would generate and amplify electrical fields. Christopher Dunn, a master craftsman and engineer, spent decades analyzing the pyramid and concluded it was a power plant. Specifically, it was designed to convert seismic energy and acoustic resonance into microwave radiation. The internal chambers form a resonating cavity. The specific dimensions create harmonic frequencies. Chemical reactions in the chambers, probably involving hydrogen and hydrated zinc chloride, would have produced additional energy that the quartz crystals converted into electromagnetic radiation. Why would you need that? Because microwave energy can be transmitted through the atmosphere without wires. It can power vehicles, charge devices, run machinery from a distance. If you had a civilization that needed massive amounts of wireless power, say for flying vehicles or mining equipment or communication devices, a pyramid acting as a broadcast power station would be incredibly useful. Place several around the globe, and you have a planetary energy grid. This explains why pyramids exist on every continent, not just Egypt, Mexico, Peru, China, Bosnia, Indonesia, even underwater structures near Japan and Cuba. They are all positioned with mathematical relationships to each other, all aligned to celestial coordinates, all built with massive stones that conventional technology cannot explain. They were not built by separate cultures coincidentally developing the same architecture. They were built by one advanced civilization, as part of an integrated system, the Anunnaki global infrastructure. Then we have Baalbek in Lebanon, and this is where things get really crazy. The temple platform at Baalbek sits on foundation stones called the trilithon, 3 blocks each weighing approximately 800 tons. That is 1.6 million pounds per block. And that is not even the impressive part. There is a 4th stone, still in the quarry, called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing roughly 1,200 tons. It was quarried, shaped, and prepared for transport but never moved from its location. Engineers today cannot move 1,200-ton blocks. The largest cranes in the world max out around 20,000 tons of lifting capacity, but that requires massive setup, specialized equipment, and carefully controlled conditions. How do you move a 1,200-ton block in ancient times with no cranes, no wheels strong enough to support that weight, no roads capable of bearing that load? You do not, unless you have technology that negates or reduces mass. The ancient texts, particularly Hindu Vedic literature, describe something called vimana, flying vehicles used by the gods. These were not metaphorical. The descriptions are technical, including details about construction materials, propulsion systems, weapon systems. They describe craft that could fly through air, through water, even through space. Different models for different purposes, from small single-passenger vehicles to massive flying palaces that could transport hundreds of people. More interestingly, these texts describe devices that could manipulate gravity. They talk about levitation stones and sound frequencies that could make objects weightless. If you had acoustic levitation technology, suddenly those 1,200-ton blocks become manageable. You do not lift them, you make them float, then you just push them into position. Stone circles, megalithic walls, massive temple platforms, all of it becomes possible with gravity manipulation technology that we are only beginning to theoretically understand today. The Anunnaki flying vehicles were not primitive aircraft. Ancient artwork depicts them clearly. Cylindrical or disc-shaped craft with no visible wings or propulsion, often surrounded by radiating lines, suggesting energy fields. Sumerian cylinder seals show gods inside vehicles that look remarkably like the command modules from Apollo spacecraft. Egyptian hieroglyphs at Abydos show what appear to be helicopters, submarines, and jet aircraft, though Egyptologists insist these are palimpsest, earlier carvings that coincidentally look exactly like modern vehicles when newer hieroglyphs are worn away. Sure, coincidence. Flight technology requires navigation, which brings us to something called the ME. The Sumerian texts refer to ME as objects of power, sometimes translated as divine decrees, but that is interpretive nonsense. The ME were physical objects, small enough to be portable but containing vast amounts of information and control capabilities. Gods fought wars over ME. Possession of specific ME granted authority over certain domains or technologies. Inanna famously stole ME from Enki while he was drunk and used them to establish her own power base. What were they? The descriptions sound like advanced data storage devices, possibly quantum computers in crystalline matrices. Small objects containing the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization, everything from scientific formulas to control codes for machinery. If you captured enemy ME, you could access their technology, unlock their facilities, understand their secrets. They were literal power in physical form. This explains the obsession with certain crystals in ancient traditions. Not because crystals have mystical energy, though New Age people have run with that idea, but because crystalline structures are perfect for information storage at the molecular level. Quartz crystals can store massive amounts of data encoded in their atomic lattice structure. Modern technology is actually moving toward crystal-based storage systems for exactly this reason. The Anunnaki were apparently already there hundreds of thousands of years ago. Weapon technology is documented extensively, particularly in Hindu texts describing wars between gods. The Mahabharata describes weapons that sound disturbingly like nuclear devices. A single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns rose in all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death which reduced to ashes the entire race. That is not poetic metaphor. That is someone describing a mushroom cloud. Other passages describe the effects on survivors. Hair and nails falling out, sickness that persists for years, food becoming poisoned, radiation poisoning. The texts specifically warn against entering affected areas for years after battles, advice that makes sense only if they understood radioactive contamination. Archaeological sites in India and Pakistan show evidence of vitrification, where sand and stone were melted into glass by intense heat, temperatures consistent with nuclear detonation. Skeletons with elevated radiation levels dated to roughly 4,000 years ago. Explain that with conventional warfare. The Anunnaki did not just have destructive weapons. They had medical technology that seems like magic from our perspective. The texts describe healing chambers, rejuvenation treatments, life extension procedures. Sumerian medical texts contain surgical techniques that were supposedly rediscovered only in modern times, including brain surgery, organ transplants, and genetic manipulation procedures. The caduceus, that symbol of medicine with two serpents wrapped around a staff, comes from Sumerian depictions of NIBIRU, Enki's son who specialized in genetics. Those serpents represent DNA helixes, not snakes. Communication technology allowed the Anunnaki to maintain contact with NIBIRU across vast interplanetary distances. Ancient artwork shows gods holding or wearing what look like communication devices. Egyptian art frequently depicts gods holding Ankh symbols, which look suspiciously like portable communication units with antenna and receiver components. The shape is not decorative, it is functional. The Ankh shows up in context suggesting it provided protection, granted access, or conveyed authority, all functions you would expect from an advanced identification and communication device. Energy weapons are depicted in artwork worldwide. Egyptian gods holding scepters that shoot rays of power. Hindu gods with weapons that emit beams of light. Sumerian images showing devices that project focused energy. These were not staffs or spears. They were directed energy weapons, probably plasma or laser-based systems that could cut through stone, destroy armies, or demolish structures from a distance. When ancient texts describe walls crumbling at the sound of trumpets, like Jericho, they might be describing acoustic weapons that used resonant frequencies to literally vibrate fortifications apart. Mining technology had to be sophisticated to extract gold efficiently from deep underground deposits. The texts describe machines that eat stone and devices that could tunnel through solid rock. We find evidence of this in the ancient mines themselves. Tunnels that are too straight, too uniform, too precisely angled to have been hand-carved. Modern mining uses tunnel boring machines, mechanical monsters with rotating cutting heads that can drill through anything. The Anunnaki probably had equivalent or superior technology, maybe using focused energy beams to vaporize rock rather than mechanical cutting. Genetic engineering was perhaps their most advanced technology, and we have already discussed how they created humanity through DNA manipulation. But the capability extended far beyond just humans. Ancient texts describe hybrid creatures, chimeras combining features of different animals, bulls with human heads, lions with wings, serpents with multiple heads. Mainstream historians dismiss these as mythology, but what if they were genetic experiments? Trial runs before the successful human hybrid, failed prototypes, engineered guard creatures. The technology to create such things definitely existed in the Anunnaki laboratories. Environmental control systems allowed the Anunnaki to modify weather patterns, trigger earthquakes, control floods. This was not random magic. This was geoengineering on a planetary scale. Weather control makes sense for a civilization that needs to protect mining operations or support agriculture in specific regions. Ancient texts describe gods punishing cities by withholding rain or unleashing storms. What sounds like divine temperament might actually be deliberate manipulation of atmospheric systems using technology we are only beginning to develop today. The real question is not whether the Anunnaki had advanced technology. The evidence for that is overwhelming once you look at it without the filter of mainstream assumptions. The real question is, what happened to all of it? Where did it go? Why do we not find laser rifles in archaeological digs or nuclear reactors buried under ancient cities? Some of it was probably taken when the Anunnaki left. They did not abandon valuable technology to primitive humans who might use it destructively. Some was probably destroyed deliberately, either by the Anunnaki themselves as part of their departure protocol, or by human factions fighting over the remnants. Some is probably still here, hidden in locations we have not discovered, or in sites that are deliberately kept off-limits to researchers. But some knowledge was preserved, encoded in mythology, hidden in sacred texts, passed down through secret societies that understood the real history. The technology itself might be gone, but the principles remain, waiting for humanity to rediscover them, and we are rediscovering them, piece by piece. Wireless power transmission, genetic engineering, gravitational manipulation, weather control. We are rebuilding the same technological base the Anunnaki had, except we think we are inventing it for the first time. What if we are just remembering? What if our technological progress is not innovation but restoration of capabilities that were deliberately taken from us thousands of years ago? That is a terrifying thought, because it means the Anunnaki did not just rule us physically. They controlled our development, kept us at a specific level of capability, prevented us from advancing too far too fast. And when we finally start approaching their level again, what happens then? Do they come back? Do they reset us again? Or have they been here all along, watching, waiting, making sure we do not rediscover too much too quickly? Every culture on Earth has a flood story. Every single one. The Sumerians have it. The Hebrews copied it and called it Noah. The Greeks called their survivor Deucalion. The Hindus describe Manu being warned by a fish god. The Chinese have Gunyu. The Aztecs have Coxcoxtli. Australian Aborigines, Pacific Islanders, Native American tribes from Alaska to Argentina, all of them describe a time when water covered the world, and nearly everyone died, except for one family or group who were warned in advance and survived. Mainstream scholars call this coincidence, arguing that all cultures experience local flooding, so naturally they all develop flood myths. But that explanation falls apart when you look at the details. These are not just stories about rivers overflowing or coastal storms. They describe global catastrophe, waters covering mountains, all of humanity nearly wiped out, civilization having to restart from scratch. And they all happened at roughly the same time in human prehistory, around 13,000 years ago. That date should make you pause, because 13,000 years ago is exactly when something catastrophic did happen to Earth. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas Impact Event, a period when global temperatures suddenly plummeted, ice sheets advanced, sea levels rose dramatically, and mass extinction wiped out dozens of megafauna species. The evidence is undeniable. A layer of sediment containing iridium and nanodiamonds, materials that only form under extreme pressure and heat, distributed globally and dated to approximately 10,800 BC. Something hit Earth hard enough to trigger worldwide devastation. But here is where the Anunnaki story takes a dark turn. According to the ancient texts, they knew it was coming. They knew, and they said nothing. The tablets describe a council meeting among the Anunnaki leadership when NIBIRU's approach began affecting Earth's climate. See, NIBIRU's highly elliptical orbit means that every 3,600 years it swings through the inner solar system, and its gravitational influence is massive. When a planet 3 to 4 times Earth's size passes relatively close in astronomical terms, it disrupts everything. Tidal forces increase, tectonic activity intensifies, atmospheric patterns destabilize. The last time NIBIRU came through, roughly 13,000 years ago, the Anunnaki astronomers calculated that its passage would trigger catastrophic events on Earth. Specifically, they predicted that gravitational stress would destabilize the Antarctic ice sheet. Antarctica was not always frozen, remember. 13,000 years ago, parts of it were still relatively ice-free or had much thinner ice coverage. The combination of NIBIRU's gravitational pull and increased tectonic activity would cause massive sections of ice to slide into the ocean, generating tsunamis that would circle the globe and inundate every coastal region on the planet, not gradually over centuries, but within hours or days. A literal wave of death traveling faster than anyone could outrun. Enlil saw this as an opportunity, maybe even divine providence, solving a problem he had been struggling with for millennia. Humanity had become too numerous, too widespread, too difficult to control. The texts describe his frustration with human noise, human population growth, human independence. We were no longer obedient workers. We were becoming a competitor species, and worse, Enki's genetic tinkering had made some humans nearly as intelligent as the Anunnaki themselves. Enlil feared that if humanity continued advancing, we would eventually challenge Anunnaki supremacy. So, when the projections showed that a natural disaster would eliminate most of humanity, Enlil made a decision that can only be called genocidal. He convened the Council of 12 and demanded they all swear an oath. No Anunnaki would warn humanity about the coming catastrophe. They would let nature take its course. The mining operations could be rebuilt afterward using the survivors, who would be fewer, weaker, more traumatized, and therefore easier to control. It was a calculated genocide disguised as non-interference. The texts are explicit about this. Enlil demanded silence. He wanted humanity destroyed, or at least reduced to manageable numbers. And according to the tablets, most of the Anunnaki went along with it. Some because they agreed with Enlil's reasoning, some because they were afraid to defy him, some because they simply did not care whether humans lived or died. We were just tools that could be replaced if necessary. But Enki could not accept it. Throughout all the millennia of Anunnaki presence on Earth, Enki had been humanity's advocate, our creator and protector. He saw potential in us that the others denied. Whether this was compassion, scientific pride in his creation, or long-term strategic calculation is debatable. Maybe all three. But when the council demanded silence, Enki made a choice that would define human survival. He decided to break the oath and warn someone. He could not warn everyone. That would be too obvious, and would bring Enlil's wrath down on him directly. But he could save a remnant, ensure that humanity and the knowledge they carried would survive. He selected a man named Ziusudra in the Sumerian texts, Utnapishtim in the Akkadian version, and eventually Noah in the Hebrew retelling. This was not a random choice. Ziusudra was from a bloodline family, carrying high concentrations of Anunnaki DNA, which meant he was intelligent, capable, and likely to successfully execute a complex survival plan. The texts describe Enki visiting Ziusudra in a dream, or speaking to him through a reed wall, probably because Enki needed plausible deniability if questioned about breaking the oath. He told Ziusudra exactly what was coming: a wall of water that would destroy everything, triggered by celestial events beyond human control. And then he gave Ziusudra detailed technical instructions for building a survival vessel. This was not a wooden boat, understand. The specifications described in the original Sumerian texts sound nothing like the children's story arc, with animals walking up a ramp 2 by 2. The vessel was massive, possibly a cube or rectangular shape, covered entirely with pitch for waterproofing, subdivided into multiple sealed compartments. The design sounds more like a submersible bunker, something meant to survive being tossed around in apocalyptic seas while keeping its contents alive. Enki instructed Ziusudra to bring his family, obviously, but also specimens of animals, seeds, and critically, the ME tablets containing advanced knowledge. This was not just about physical survival. This was about preserving civilization itself, making sure that when the waters receded, humanity would not have to start over from Stone Age conditions. Ziusudra was being tasked with saving the genetic and intellectual heritage of the pre-flood world. The construction probably took years. You cannot build something that massive in secret overnight. But Mesopotamia was experiencing increasing climate instability, the early warning signs of what was coming, so perhaps Ziusudra's neighbors dismissed him as crazy, building a boat when there was no water nearby, rambling about disasters predicted by dreams. The texts describe people mocking him right up until the day the sky darkened and the ground started shaking. When NIBIRU reached its closest approach, everything Enki predicted came true. Gravitational stress triggered massive earthquakes. The Antarctic ice sheet destabilized, sending cubic miles of ice sliding into the ocean. The resulting displacement created mega tsunamis that radiated outward in all directions. Coastal cities that had existed for thousands of years were obliterated in minutes. Millions of humans drowned as water surged hundreds of miles inland, swallowing entire civilizations. But the flooding was not the only catastrophe. The asteroid or comet fragments that accompanied Nibiru's passage, debris caught in its gravitational field, bombarded Earth's atmosphere. Impact events triggered additional earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Ash and dust filled the sky, blocking sunlight and triggering rapid cooling. The text describes 7 days of darkness, rain that fell like the sky was bleeding, fires that erupted spontaneously across the landscape. The Anunnaki themselves evacuated to orbit, watching from their spacecraft as the world below was torn apart. The texts describe them looking down at the destruction and weeping, especially the female Anunnaki, who had grown attached to humans despite official policy treating us as disposable labor. Even Enlil apparently had second thoughts as he watched the scale of death, though whether that was genuine remorse or just shock at the totality of destruction is unclear. Ziusudra's vessel survived, exactly as Enki designed it to. It was battered, tossed by waves the size of mountains, subjected to forces that would have torn apart any conventional ship. But the sealed compartments prevented flooding, the massive structure provided stability, and when the waters finally began to recede after months of chaos, the Ark came to rest on elevated ground, probably on Mount Ararat, or a nearby peak in the Armenian highlands. The geological evidence supports all of this. There is a clear sediment layer, dated to approximately 10,800 BC, found at sites around the world, containing marine deposits far inland from current coastlines. Sea levels rose over 400 feet in a relatively short period. Coastal cities that existed before this date are now underwater, which explains why we keep finding inexplicable ruins on continental shelves. The cities off the coast of Cuba, the structures near Japan, the formations near India, these were not built underwater. The water came to them. Core samples from ice sheets show a dramatic climate shift at exactly this time. Global temperatures dropped by over 20 degrees Fahrenheit within decades. Forests that covered what is now the Sahara Desert died off rapidly. Megafauna that had survived for millions of years went extinct within centuries. The world that existed before 13,000 years ago was fundamentally different from the world that emerged afterward. And here is the critical point. Human civilization before the flood was apparently more advanced than we have been taught. The survivors were not starting from zero. They carried knowledge, preserved in those ME tablets, that allowed them to restart agriculture, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy far more quickly than natural development would explain. This is why Sumerian civilization appears suddenly in the historical record around 4000 BC, fully formed with no apparent developmental period. It was not new. It was rebuilt, restored from pre-flood knowledge. But most of humanity was gone. The texts describe Enlil's shock when he discovered that Enki had saved Ziusudra's family. His rage was apocalyptic, pun intended. Enki had violated the sacred oath, defied the council's decision, ensured that humanity survived when Enlil had wanted us erased. The confrontation between the brothers nearly led to civil war among the Anunnaki. Ultimately, Anu intervened from NIBIRU and negotiated a compromise. Humanity would be allowed to continue existing, but under stricter controls. Shorter lifespans, implemented through genetic modification, limitations on the knowledge we could access, divisions created among human populations, so we would fight each other rather than unify against our creators. The post-flood world would be carefully managed to prevent humans from ever again reaching the level of development and independence we had achieved before the catastrophe. So the flood was not entirely natural, and it was not entirely intentional. It was a natural event that some beings with foreknowledge allowed to happen, using it as cover for genocide. The question that haunts the story is this: if Enlil had warned humanity, could we have prepared? Could more people have survived? How many millions died because of one being's decision to remain silent? And the darker question, is it going to happen again? NIBIRU's orbit is regular, predictable. If it caused catastrophe 13,000 years ago, and it comes around every 3,600 years, then it has passed through 3 more times since the flood. Each passage would have triggered smaller disruptions, possibly coinciding with other historical catastrophes that mainstream history attributes to other causes. And the next passage? The math puts it sometime this century. Maybe it is already approaching. Maybe that is why certain governments are building underground bunkers and seed vaults. Maybe they know something they are not telling us. Maybe history is about to repeat itself. And once again, those with knowledge are choosing silence. After the floodwaters receded and survivors emerged from their shelters, the world was unrecognizable. Entire civilizations had been erased. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were buried under layers of mud and sediment. Knowledge preserved in libraries was lost. Infrastructure collapsed. The few 100,000 humans who survived found themselves scattered across a planet that had been literally reshaped by catastrophe. The Anunnaki returned from orbit expecting to find a clean slate, a planet wiped nearly clean of human presence. What they found instead was work. Their mining facilities were destroyed. Their cities were damaged or buried. The agricultural systems that had fed the human workforce no longer existed. If they wanted to rebuild their gold extraction operation, they would have to rebuild human civilization first. And they needed to do it in a way that would never again allow humans to become independent enough to threaten Anunnaki control. So they invented kingship, not the concept of leadership. Humans had leaders before the flood. But the specific institution of divine monarchy, the idea that certain bloodlines were chosen by gods to rule over others with absolute authority, this was social engineering on a massive scale, creating a control structure that would persist for millennia and still shapes human society today. The Sumerian king list is one of the most controversial archaeological documents ever discovered. Carved in cuneiform on ancient clay tablets, It records every ruler of Sumerian cities going back to the beginning of kingship itself. And the beginning, according to this document, was literally when kingship descended from heaven after the flood, not a metaphor. A direct statement that the institution of monarchy was given to humans by the gods as a gift or tool for organizing society. But here is where it gets weird. The king list records individual rulers reigning for thousands of years, not symbolically. The numbers are specific. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings total before the flood, with reigns ranging from 18,000 to 43,000 years, totaling 241,000 years of recorded kingship before the catastrophe. Mainstream historians dismiss these numbers as mythological exaggeration, arguing that ancient people did not understand large numbers, or that years meant something different. But both explanations fall apart under scrutiny. The Sumerians were mathematical geniuses who invented the base 60 number system we still use for time and angles. They understood large numbers perfectly well, and the year lengths are consistent with astronomical observations recorded in their texts, so they were not using some alternate definition of year. What if the numbers are accurate? What if these pre-flood kings were actually Anunnaki or Anunnaki human hybrids, with radically extended lifespans ruling over early human populations? That would explain why the reigns are so impossibly long by our standards but were recorded matter-of-factly as historical fact. To beings who lived for tens of thousands of years, these were not legendary figures from the distant past. They were recent history, maybe even within living memory of the oldest Anunnaki. After the flood, something changed. The king list shows reigns suddenly dropping to more human timescales, though still longer than we consider normal. Post-flood kings ruled for hundreds of years instead of thousands. Etana of Kish supposedly ruled for 1660 years. Meskiagasha of Uruk for 325 years. Still impossibly long by modern standards, but a dramatic reduction from pre-flood numbers. This matches exactly what the ancient texts describe. A deliberate shortening of human lifespan implemented by the Anunnaki after the flood. The biblical text captures this in Genesis, when God declares that human years will be limited to 120, a dramatic reduction from the patriarchs who supposedly lived for hundreds of years. This was not natural aging catching up with humanity. This was genetic modification, probably removing or deactivating the longevity genes that Enki had originally included in our design. Why shorten our lives? Control. Longer-lived humans accumulate more knowledge, more wisdom, more organizational capacity. They can plan across centuries instead of decades. They can see patterns that short-lived individuals miss. By reducing human lifespan, the Anunnaki ensured that knowledge would have to be passed down through generations, creating opportunities for information to be lost, distorted, or controlled. It made us easier to manipulate, easier to keep ignorant, easier to rule. The first post-flood kings were chosen carefully. They came from bloodline families that had survived the catastrophe, humans carrying the highest concentrations of Anunnaki DNA. These were not random peasants elevated to leadership. They were genetic aristocracy, literally bred to rule because their neurology was closer to Anunnaki baseline than average humans. They were taller, stronger, smarter, longer-lived than common people. Not by accident, by design. Each king ruled as the direct representative of a specific Anunnaki patron. The king of Uruk served Inanna, the king of Kish served Enlil, the king of Eridu served Enki. This was not symbolic. The gods actively involved themselves in selecting rulers, deposing incompetent or disobedient kings, and sometimes even producing children with human royalty to reinforce the bloodline quality. This is where the Nephilim enter the story. Genesis mentions them briefly. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. Christianity tries to turn this into a morality tale about fallen angels, but the original Hebrew is clear. Sons of God means exactly that. Divine beings. Anunnaki, having children with human women. These hybrid offspring were special, stronger than normal humans, more intelligent, longer lived. often physically larger, which is where legends of giants come from. And they were exactly what the Anunnaki needed, a ruling class that was human enough to relate to common people, but Anunnaki enough to be loyal to their divine parents and capable of enforcing divine will. The Nephilim became the kings, the heroes, the founders of dynasties. Gilgamesh is the most famous example. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes him as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, which mathematically makes no sense unless you understand he was the product of multi-generational hybridization with Anunnaki genetics on both sides of his family tree. He ruled Uruk around 2700 BC, and the epic describes him as impossibly strong, capable of feats no normal human could accomplish, and obsessed with finding immortality because he had Anunnaki ancestors who lived for thousands of years, and he wanted that lifespan for himself. His quest for immortality leads him to Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for the flood survivor we discussed earlier. Gilgamesh travels to the ends of the earth searching for this legendary figure who supposedly achieved eternal life. When he finally finds Utnapishtim, the old man tells him the flood story, explains how he survived through divine intervention, and reveals that his immortality was a one-time gift from the gods, not a technique that can be replicated. This story is fascinating because it shows that even a few thousand years after the flood, the event was already passing into legend. Gilgamesh has to undertake an epic journey just to find someone who remembers what actually happened. Knowledge was being lost, deliberately obscured, turned into mythology. The Anunnaki were actively managing human collective memory, ensuring that we would forget our true origins and the real history of the pre-flood world. Royal bloodlines became obsessed with genetic purity. Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Persian kings married their daughters. European royalty intermarried across national lines to keep thrones within related families. This was not just about concentrating wealth or political power. It was about preserving Anunnaki DNA concentrations. Dilution through intermarriage with common people would reduce the genetic advantages that made these families capable of ruling in the first place. The rituals surrounding kingship reinforced this divine connection. Coronation ceremonies involved anointing with sacred oils, literally anointing the king with substances that supposedly contained divine essence. Crowns incorporated specific metals and gemstones, possibly because these materials had symbolic or actual technological significance in Anunnaki culture. Thrones were positioned in specific orientations, aligned to celestial coordinates. All of it designed to mark the king as fundamentally different from ordinary humans, a bridge between earth and heaven. But kingship came with a cost. These rulers were puppets ultimately. They served at the pleasure of their Anunnaki patrons and could be removed if they became disobedient or incompetent. Kings who challenged divine authority or tried to claim independent power were destroyed, their cities razed, their bloodlines exterminated. The message was clear: you rule because we allow it, and we can take it away whenever we choose. The relationship between kings and gods shaped everything about early civilization. Laws were supposedly dictated by gods and merely transcribed by kings. The Code of Hammurabi explicitly states that the laws were given to Hammurabi by the sun god Shamash. Kings did not make laws. They received laws from divine authority and enforced them on behalf of the gods. This stripped rulers of personal accountability. If people were unhappy with laws, they could not blame the king. He was just following divine orders. Taxation systems funded temple construction and maintenance, which conveniently meant that a significant portion of agricultural surplus flowed to the Anunnaki. Tribute and offerings accumulated in temple storehouses, gold and silver and grain, all technically belonging to the gods, but practically controlled by the priest class, who managed these resources on behalf of their divine patrons. It was a brilliant economic system that funneled wealth upward toward the Anunnaki while making it seem like religious devotion rather than exploitation. Military campaigns required divine approval. Kings consulted oracles and priests before major battles, ensuring that warfare served Anunnaki strategic interests. When Anunnaki factions were in conflict, their human proxy armies fought each other, settling divine disputes through human bloodshed. Cities rose and fell, based on which god was currently winning political struggles among the Council of 12. Human soldiers thought they were fighting for glory or territory. Really, they were pawns in games between beings they worshipped as gods. The genetic legacy of this system persists today. Studies of European royal bloodlines show unusual genetic markers concentrated in these families, some of which appear nowhere else in the general population. Researchers struggle to explain these anomalies using conventional evolutionary models, but if these bloodlines descend from Anunnaki human hybrids, suddenly the genetic peculiarities make sense. They are not human mutations. They are remnants of alien DNA that has survived dozens or hundreds of generations of breeding. Modern elites, the families that control global finance, politics, and industry, obsessively track their genealogies. They marry within their class, maintaining separation from common people. They claim their wealth and power come from intelligence and hard work, but their real advantage might be genetic, inherited from ancestors who were literally designed to rule. The divine right of kings never went away. It just got rebranded as meritocracy while the same bloodlines maintained their grip on power across millennia. Kingship descended from heaven, and it never really left. We think we live in democracies, but the same families dominate generation after generation, century after century. Coincidence? Or genetic legacy from a time when gods walked among us and chose certain bloodlines to rule in their name? The crowns and thrones are mostly gone, but the power structure remains, hidden behind corporate boards and political parties, still serving interests that might not be entirely human. For thousands of years after the flood, an uneasy peace held among the Anunnaki. Enlil controlled the northern territories from his seat at Nippur. Enki maintained his southern domains from Eridu. The other gods divided the world among themselves according to agreements that had been negotiated and renegotiated countless times. Human civilization rebuilt itself under divine supervision. Cities rose from the mud. Populations recovered. Everything seemed stable on the surface. But underneath, resentments festered. Family grudges that had been simmering for hundreds of thousands of years. Territorial disputes over the most productive regions. Competition for human labor and resources. And most dangerously, the ambitions of the second generation, gods born on Earth, who saw this planet as their birthright, not some colonial outpost of NIBIRU. They wanted power for themselves, not to serve as middle managers in someone else's empire. Marduk was the spark that ignited everything. Enki's firstborn son, brilliant and charismatic, but also arrogant and power-hungry. He watched his father defer to Enlil for millennia despite being the older brother, despite being more intelligent, despite having accomplished more. In Marduk's eyes, this was injustice compounded across generations. His family deserved to rule Earth absolutely, not share power with Enlil's lineage. And Marduk was not content to wait for political solutions or peaceful transitions. He wanted what he believed was rightfully his, and he was willing to fight for it. The conflict erupted around 2024 BC, though tensions had been building for centuries before that. Marduk had established his power base in Babylon, transforming it from a minor settlement into a major city that rivaled the traditional Anunnaki strongholds. He attracted followers from among both the younger Anunnaki and ambitious humans who saw opportunities in backing a rising power. He openly challenged the authority of the council, declaring that the old order was finished, and a new age was beginning with him at its center. Enlil's son Ninurta was tasked with putting down this rebellion. Ninurta was the military commander of the Anunnaki forces, a warrior god who had fought in countless conflicts. He gathered an army of loyal Anunnaki and their human auxiliaries and marched on Babylon, expecting to crush Marduk quickly and decisively. What he got instead was a war that would devastate the region and fundamentally alter human civilization. The texts describe weapons that make modern military technology look primitive. The brilliance of 7 suns that could incinerate armies, storms of fire that consumed entire cities, poison wind that killed everyone it touched but left structures standing. These are not poetic exaggerations. These are technical descriptions of advanced weapon systems, possibly plasma weapons, directed energy devices, and most terrifyingly, nuclear armaments. Marduk had prepared for this confrontation. He had fortified Babylon with defenses that could withstand conventional assault. When Ninurta's forces attacked, they found themselves unable to breach the city's walls using normal weapons. The siege dragged on, months turning into years, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Both factions called in support from allies across the Anunnaki network, turning a local conflict into a global war. Human populations were conscripted into massive armies, forced to fight in battles between gods, dying by the thousands for causes they barely understood. The turning point came when Nergal and Ninurta made a decision that would haunt history. Unable to defeat Marduk through conventional means, they requested authorization from the council to use the awesome weapons, devices so destructive they had been locked away since ancient times, forbidden except in the most extreme circumstances. The texts describe these weapons as being stored in a secret location in Africa, guarded and sealed, waiting for a crisis that would justify their use. That crisis had arrived. The council, dominated by Enlil's faction, approved the use of these weapons against not just Babylon but against several other cities that supported Marduk's rebellion. The targets included Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar cities that would become infamous in biblical tradition for their destruction by divine fire. But the real target, the strategic objective, was something else entirely. These cities sat near the space facilities that the Anunnaki used for launching and landing spacecraft. Control of these sites meant control of communication with NIBIRU and the ability to transport resources off-planet. If Marduk seized these facilities, he could cut off Enlil's faction from reinforcements and supplies, potentially giving him the leverage to force a political settlement on his terms. Destroying the space facilities would be devastating to both sides, but Enlil's faction calculated that they could rebuild them later, whereas allowing Marduk to capture them intact would be an irreversible strategic defeat. So, they dropped the bombs. 7 weapons were deployed against targets across the Middle East. The tablets describe the operation in detail. Era, one of Nergal's lieutenants, piloted the craft carrying the weapons. As he approached each target, he released the brilliance that scans the land, that which by all that lives is dreaded. The weapons detonated with a flash like no other, creating fireballs that rose to the heaven's heart. The explosions generated winds evil, an evil blast heralding the evil storm, and these winds carried death across the landscape. Archaeological evidence confirms something catastrophic happened in this region around 2000 BC. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, if they have been correctly identified at the southern end of the Dead Sea, show signs of sudden violent destruction. The area contains unusually high concentrations of radioactive materials, particularly in the topsoil and stone surfaces. Sulfur deposits in the region have peculiar isotopic signatures inconsistent with natural geological processes. More dramatically, large areas of the Sinai Peninsula show evidence of vitrification sand melted into glass by temperatures exceeding 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. This only happens through nuclear detonation or meteorite impact, and there is no impact crater. The vitrified areas form linear patterns, suggesting multiple airbursts rather than ground impacts, exactly what you would expect from strategic bombing runs. Then there is the matter of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, part of the Indus Valley civilization. This city shows evidence of sudden catastrophic destruction around 2000 BC. Skeletons found in the streets display characteristics consistent with radiation exposure. Rapid death, with no signs of violence or disease, bodies lying where they fell, as if people were killed mid-activity. Some skeletons have elevated radiation levels even today, 4,000 years later. Buildings show heat damage inconsistent with conventional fire, but consistent with intense thermal flash. Ancient Hindu texts describe this destruction in terms that sound like eyewitness accounts of nuclear war. The Mahabharata describes the weapon used against Mohenjo-Daro, a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as the 1,000 suns rose in all its splendor. When the weapon was unleashed, it was like the blast furnaces of the gods. The text goes on to describe the aftermath: corpses burned beyond recognition, survivors losing hair and nails, food becoming poisoned, rivers boiling. radiation sickness. But the Anunnaki miscalculated something crucial. They understood the immediate destructive effects of their weapons, the blast radius, the thermal damage, the electromagnetic pulse. What they did not fully account for was the fallout pattern. The prevailing winds carried radioactive particles east and south, away from the intended target zones and across Sumeria itself. The very civilization the Anunnaki had built, the cities they had ruled for millennia, were poisoned by their own weapons. The tablets describe the horror as the evil wind reached Sumerian cities. People sickened and died without visible wounds. Livestock perished in the fields. Water became undrinkable. Crops withered despite adequate rainfall. The texts use the word namtar, which scholars translate as fate or destiny, but in context clearly means radiation or radioactive contamination. The Anunnaki who were present when namtar arrived recognized it immediately and fled in terror, abandoning human populations to their fate. One of the greatest cities of Sumeria, was devastated not by direct attack but by fallout. The lament for describes the city's destruction in haunting detail. On the day the storm crushed the land, the people groan. On that day, the storm forced people to live in darkness. On that day, the storm annihilated the land. This was not poetic metaphor. This was survivors describing environmental catastrophe, the sky darkening with radioactive ash, ecosystems collapsing under contamination. Within a generation, Sumerian civilization effectively ended. Cities were abandoned. Population plummeted. The elaborate administrative systems collapsed. Writing nearly disappeared for a time as the scribal class died off without replacement. When civilization eventually recovered in the region, it was dominated by Akkadians and later Babylonians, different peoples with different languages. The Sumerian cultural continuity that had lasted for thousands of years was broken. And Marduk? He survived. His stronghold in Babylon was outside the primary contamination zone. While Enlil's faction-controlled territory was poisoned and depopulated, Marduk emerged from the war weakened militarily, but positioned to dominate politically. The old power centers were ruined. The traditional Anunnaki ruling structure was shattered. In the vacuum, Marduk's Babylon rose to become the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Ironically, the war Enlil started to prevent Marduk from gaining control ended up giving Marduk exactly what he wanted. The radioactive fallout did what Marduk's armies could not. It destroyed the northern power base that Enlil had maintained for hundreds of thousands of years. By 1800 BC, Babylon under Hammurabi, who was almost certainly a puppet or descendant of Marduk's genetic line, controlled Mesopotamia. The old gods still had influence, but their direct rule was finished. The environmental damage persisted for centuries. The Sahara Desert, which had been grassland and forest as recently as 5000 BC, underwent rapid desertification that accelerated dramatically after 2000 BC. Some of this was natural climate change, but radioactive contamination could have accelerated the ecosystem collapse. Similarly, the Thar Desert in India expanded rapidly during this period. Regions that had supported dense populations became uninhabitable wastelands. Global climate shifted. Ice core samples show unusual atmospheric conditions in the early 2nd millennium BC, with particulate matter consistent with massive fires or explosions. Agricultural productivity declined worldwide, contributing to the Bronze Age collapse that would occur a few centuries later. The Anunnaki's war did not just destroy specific cities, it damaged Earth's entire biosphere. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Humans who witnessed these events, or heard first-hand accounts, understood that the gods possessed power beyond comprehension, power that could erase civilization in moments. This knowledge reinforced submission to divine authority for millennia. Who would dare rebel against beings who could call down the sun itself to destroy cities? The fear generated by these ancient nuclear strikes echo through religious traditions even today, in concepts like divine judgment, apocalyptic punishment, and the wrath of God. But the most chilling aspect is this. The Anunnaki proved willing to destroy Earth's environment and kill millions of humans to settle their internal power struggles. We were not their children to be protected. We were their property to be risked in their conflicts. Our cities, our lives, Our world were expendable resources in wars that had nothing to do with human interests, and they used weapons that would make our entire nuclear arsenal look like firecrackers, weapons that could literally turn sand into glass and create deserts from fertile land. Those weapons still exist somewhere. If the texts are accurate, not all of them were used. Some remained in storage, sealed away, waiting. And if the Anunnaki return, if the old conflicts reignite, what happens to us? We have rebuilt civilization on land they still consider theirs. We live in cities built over ruins they created. When they come back, are we caught in the crossfire again? Or worse, are we the battlefield? Something changed around 2000 BC. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Anunnaki had been physically present on Earth, walking among humans, living in their ziggurats, directly controlling civilization. Then, within a few centuries, they vanished. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, systematically, the gods withdrew from direct human contact until only their memory remained. The official departure was not announced. There were no farewell ceremonies or public explanations. Instead, the historical record shows a pattern. Gods who had been actively involved in human affairs simply stopped appearing. Temple records that once documented regular divine visits and communications suddenly contained only rituals performed to absent deities. Kings who previously received direct instructions from their patron gods now consulted priests who interpreted omens and dreams, filtering divine will through human intermediaries instead of receiving it firsthand. Why did they leave? The texts hint at multiple factors converging simultaneously. The nuclear devastation from the wars between Marduk and Enlil's faction had contaminated large sections of their operational territory. Their cities were poisoned, their infrastructure damaged, their human workforce decimated. Rebuilding would require enormous resources and time. But more fundamentally, something had shifted in the relationship between Anunnaki and their home world. NIBIRU's orbit was carrying it away from the inner solar system again, beginning its 3,600-year journey back into the frozen outer reaches. Communication with Earth became more difficult as distance increased. Supply lines stretched beyond practical limits. The Anunnaki, who had been stationed on Earth for millennia, faced a choice: return to Nibiru with the departing orbital window, or remain on Earth knowing they would be isolated from home for another 3,000 years with no reinforcements, no resupply, no support. Most chose to leave. The mining operation that had justified their presence for 450,000 years was no longer economically viable. The easy gold deposits had been exhausted. Deeper mining required more energy, more infrastructure, more labor than the depleted post-war population could provide. The cost-benefit analysis no longer made sense. Whatever gold could be extracted from Earth in the coming centuries was not worth maintaining a permanent colonial presence. But there was another factor, one that scared them more than they admitted in their official communications. Humanity was becoming dangerous. Not militarily, we were still primitive compared to Anunnaki technology. Dangerous because we were learning, evolving, adapting faster than they had anticipated. The genetic modifications Enki had made were expressing in unexpected ways. Humans were developing abstract reasoning, creative problem-solving, technological innovation. We were asking questions that slaves should not ask, imagining possibilities that workers should not imagine. The Anunnaki recognized the pattern. They had created an intelligent species to serve them, and now that species was approaching the threshold where servitude would no longer be acceptable. Given another few thousand years of development, humans might reach technological parity with their creators. We might demand equality, independence, sovereignty over our own world. And there were billions of us compared to a few hundred of them. The mathematics of that confrontation were unfavorable. Better to withdraw while they still controlled the narrative, while humans still believed the gods were gods rather than recognizing them as advanced beings who could be challenged, questioned, maybe even defeated. Better to leave humanity in a state of civilizational adolescence, capable enough to maintain basic society, but not advanced enough to threaten Anunnaki interests when they eventually returned. The departure was methodical and strategic. First, They sealed off or destroyed the most advanced facilities, ensuring humans could not access technology that might accelerate our development. The spaceports were decommissioned, launch platforms dismantled or buried, underground tunnel networks connecting major sites were collapsed or flooded. The ziggurats remained as monuments, impressive reminders of divine power, but the functional equipment inside them was removed or rendered inoperative. Knowledge systems were restricted. The ME tablets containing advanced scientific information were collected and either taken back to NIBIRU or hidden in secret locations guarded by loyal human servants. Writing itself was suppressed among common populations. Literacy became the privilege of priest classes who could be controlled, monitored, and, if necessary, eliminated. Mathematical knowledge above basic counting was classified as sacred mystery, taught only to initiates who swore oaths of secrecy. But they did not leave completely, and this is the crucial detail that historians miss. The texts describe certain Anunnaki choosing to remain behind, accepting permanent exile from NIBIRU to maintain monitoring operations on Earth. These were the Watchers, the Guardians, beings who transitioned from direct rule to covert influence. They established the secret societies, the mystery schools, the esoteric traditions that would preserve fragments of Anunnaki knowledge while keeping it hidden from general human access. Who were these Watchers? The texts provide names: Shamash, Ningishzida, a handful of others from various factions who had different reasons for staying. Some believed humanity needed continued guidance to avoid self-destruction. Some wanted to ensure their family bloodlines maintained power even without direct Anunnaki presence. Some were probably exiled, punished for their role in the catastrophic wars by being sentenced to remain on the world they had helped ruin. These remnant Anunnaki integrated into human society in ways that allowed them to shape civilization while remaining hidden. They became the wise advisors to kings, the mysterious teachers who founded philosophical schools, the architects who designed temples encoding advanced mathematical knowledge, the healers who preserved medical techniques, the astrologers who maintained astronomical data. They worked through human proxies, selecting individuals from the bloodline families, training them, empowering them to act as agents of the hidden agenda. This explains the sudden appearance of wise men throughout ancient history, mysterious figures who arrived in various civilizations bringing advanced knowledge that transformed society. Thoth in Egypt, Oannes in Babylon, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, cultural heroes described as bringing writing, mathematics, agriculture, and law to primitive peoples. These were not mythological figures. They were Anunnaki, or their hybrid descendants, acting as cultural intervention specialists, guiding human development along paths that served long-term Anunnaki interests. The promise to return appears in virtually every ancient tradition. The Sumerian texts describe Anu declaring that the gods would come back when the time was right, when humanity had proven itself worthy, or when circumstances required divine intervention. The Egyptian texts speak of the return of the gods at the end of an age. Hindu scriptures describe cyclical ages where gods periodically re-establish direct contact with humanity. Biblical prophecy is filled with second coming imagery, the return of divine beings to judge and rule. This was not spiritual comfort food. This was strategic messaging. By promising to return, the Anunnaki ensured that human populations would maintain religious devotion and social structures favorable to their eventual re-establishment of control. If people believe the gods are watching and will return to reward the faithful and punish the disobedient, they police themselves. They maintain the systems of hierarchy, submission, and obedience even without direct oversight. It was social programming on a civilizational scale, designed to persist for millennia. The priesthoods became the institutional memory of Anunnaki rule, preserving not just religious rituals but political structures that reinforced the old order. Temple hierarchies mirrored the Council of 12, priests dressed in regalia that echoed Anunnaki clothing. Rituals reenacted mythologized versions of Anunnaki activities. The faithful were taught to see themselves as servants awaiting their master's return, not as free beings exploring their own potential. Secret societies took this further, creating initiatory hierarchies where knowledge was parceled out in stages, ensuring that only the most trusted individuals reached levels where true history was revealed. The Egyptian mystery schools, the Babylonian Magi, the Greek Eleusinian mysteries, all of these preserved fragments of Anunnaki knowledge while keeping it sequestered from public access. Only those who proved their loyalty through years of testing gained access to the inner teachings, and even then, they were sworn to secrecy under penalty of death. These societies evolved into the medieval guilds, the Renaissance secret orders, the Enlightenment-era brotherhoods that shaped Western history. The same bloodline families maintained their positions across generations, marrying within their class, preserving genetic advantages inherited from Anunnaki ancestors. They became the aristocracy, the merchant princes, the banking dynasties that controlled resources and influenced politics, not through conspiracy in the modern sense, but through inherited advantage and institutional knowledge passed down from when gods walked the earth. The technology was mostly gone, but the principles remained. Geometry encoded in temple architecture, astronomical knowledge preserved in mythological star charts, medical techniques disguised as folk remedies, metallurgical secrets protected by craft guilds, agricultural knowledge maintained by monastic orders. All of it fragmented, distributed across multiple traditions and cultures, so that no single human group could reconstruct the complete picture of what the Anunnaki had possessed. But they left markers, breadcrumbs, scattered across the landscape, monuments aligned to celestial coordinates that would only make sense to a civilization with advanced astronomical knowledge, carvings depicting spacecraft and technologies that primitive people should not have witnessed, genetic lineages carrying DNA markers that do not fit standard human evolutionary patterns, all of it waiting for a time when humanity would advance enough to recognize these clues for what they are. Evidence of the Anunnaki presence and proof that they intend to return. Because return they will. The orbital mechanics are predictable. NIBIRU follows its 3,600-year cycle with astronomical precision. If the last passage caused the Bronze Age collapse and societal upheaval around 1200 BC, then the next approach is coming soon. Maybe it is already underway. Maybe those in power, the descendants of the bloodline families, the heirs to the secret knowledge, know exactly when it will arrive. Maybe that explains the sudden urgency around space programs, underground bunker construction, seed vaults, and billionaire rocket companies. Maybe the Watchers have received communication that the return is imminent. And when they come back, what happens to us? Are we still seen as property, as a genetically engineered slave race that exists to serve Anunnaki interests? Or have we evolved enough to demand recognition as an independent species with rights to our own world? The answer to that question will determine whether the return of the gods is humanity's salvation or our extinction event. But either way, the age of their absence is ending. The shadows that have hidden them for millennia are thinning, and what emerges might not be what we expected or what we prayed for all these centuries. It might be exactly what we should have feared. Fast forward to April 2003. American troops have just taken Baghdad. The city is in chaos. Government buildings burning, infrastructure collapsing, lawlessness spreading through the streets. And in the midst of this chaos, while international media focuses on toppled statues and political drama, something else is happening. The National Museum of Iraq is being systematically looted, not by random thieves grabbing whatever looks valuable, by organized teams who knew exactly what they were looking for. Over 15,000 artifacts disappeared in 48 hours. Cuneiform tablets, cylinder seals, Sumerian antiquities dating back 5,000 years or more. Items that had survived millennia of conquest and upheaval suddenly vanished while the world's most advanced military somehow failed to protect one of archaeology's most important repositories. The official story blames opportunistic looters taking advantage of war, but witnesses described men in suits arriving with lists, bypassing rooms full of gold jewelry to target specific storage areas containing clay tablets and ancient texts. What was on those tablets that made them more valuable than gold? What information was considered so dangerous that an entire invasion might have been partly justified to secure it? The Baghdad Museum housed some of the oldest written records of human civilization, documents describing the Anunnaki presence, genetic engineering, advanced technology, and the true history of human origins. Documents that contradicted every official narrative about religion, evolution, and the development of civilization. And now those documents are gone, disappeared into private collections or government archives where public researchers will never access them. But the Baghdad Museum is just the visible tip of this iceberg. The Vatican has been playing this game for 2,000 years. Deep beneath Vatican City lies the Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Secret Archive, until they decided that name was too obviously suspicious. Officially, it contains 85 kilometers of shelving, holding historical documents from the Catholic Church. Unofficially, it is the largest collection of suppressed knowledge in the Western world. Access is severely restricted. Scholars can request specific documents if they already know what they are looking for, and can justify why they need it. But you cannot browse, you cannot explore, you cannot discover something the Church does not want discovered, because you never get the chance to look. And certain sections are completely off limits, sealed under orders that supposedly come from papal authority, but might originate from agreements much older than the papacy itself. What is down there? Reports suggest texts in languages older than Latin or Greek, star charts that should not exist, medical treatises describing procedures that were supposedly impossible in ancient times, and tablets, many tablets, written in cuneiform and other dead languages, describing the Anunnaki presence in explicit detail. The early church fathers knew about these texts. They made a calculated decision to suppress them, to build Christian theology on a foundation that deliberately obscured humanity's true origins. Why? Because the truth would undermine the entire power structure that religion provides. If people knew we were genetically engineered by advanced beings, not created by an omnipotent God, the Church loses its authority. If people understood that the gods of the Old Testament were plural, physical beings with technology rather than miracles, the monotheistic framework collapses. If the flood was a deliberate genocide attempt rather than divine judgment on sin, the moral basis of Christianity becomes questionable. The Vatican has spent 2 millennia protecting these secrets because the institution's survival depends on maintaining the official story. Now shift your attention to Antarctica. Why is one of the world's most powerful telescopes located at the South Pole? The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, officially used for astronomical research. But you do not put a telescope in one of Earth's harshest environments, just for pretty pictures of stars. You put it there because you need to observe something that is only visible from that specific location, something approaching from the southern celestial hemisphere that you want to track without public attention. That something might be NIBIRU, or Planet 9, or whatever designation astronomers use for the massive body that mathematical models insist must exist but which has never been officially observed. In 2016, researchers at Caltech published evidence for a planet roughly 10 times Earth's mass orbiting far beyond Neptune. Their calculations showed that multiple objects in the distant solar system were being gravitationally influenced by something huge that no one had directly detected. The astronomers were cautious, calling for more data before confirmation. But the Vatican telescope? It started operations in Antarctica shortly after these calculations became public. If NIBIRU is approaching, if the 3,600-year orbit is bringing it back into the inner solar system within our lifetimes, certain institutions would absolutely know about it long before public announcement. And what would they do with that knowledge? Would they warn everyone and risk global panic? Or would they quietly prepare, ensuring that the elite, the bloodline families, the descendants of those who have always known the truth, survive whatever comes next? This explains the sudden proliferation of deep underground military bases, the DUMBs that conspiracy theorists have documented for decades. Official explanations cite strategic redundancy or nuclear war preparation. But the construction accelerated after 2000 at a pace inconsistent with Cold War logic. Massive facilities carved into mountains, connected by high-speed rail tunnels, stocked with years of supplies, designed to shelter thousands of people. Not just military personnel, selected civilians, experts in various fields, genetic diversity to rebuild civilization. These are not bunkers. These are arks, modern versions of what Ziusudra built before the last catastrophe. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is another piece of this puzzle. Built in 2008 on a remote Norwegian island, it is designed to preserve seeds from every important crop species on Earth. The official story: protection against agricultural collapse from climate change or nuclear war. But the real capacity suggests preparation for near-total biosphere destruction, the kind of damage that would require restarting agriculture from preserved genetic stock. Who builds something like that unless they have specific knowledge of an upcoming catastrophe? Then there is CRISPR and the explosion of genetic engineering research in the last decade. Humanity has suddenly acquired the ability to edit DNA with precision, to insert genes from one species into another, to create designer organisms. We are doing exactly what Enki did 450,000 years ago, and we are doing it faster than regulatory frameworks can control, as if there is urgency, as if someone with knowledge and resources is pushing this technology forward as quickly as possible. Why the rush? Maybe because the Anunnaki are returning, and the Watchers have been instructed to prepare humanity, to advance us technologically so we are more useful when they arrive. Or maybe it is the opposite. Maybe breakaway human factions, the ones who know the true history, are trying to level the playing field before the Anunnaki come back. If we can master genetic engineering, if we can extend our lifespans, if we can enhance our cognitive abilities, maybe we can negotiate from a position of strength rather than submission when our creators return. The 13 families are another thread worth pulling. Conspiracy theories identify specific bloodlines that supposedly control global finance, politics, media, and industry. The Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Warburgs, and others whose influence spans generations and continents. Mainstream analysis attributes their power to accumulated wealth and social connections. But genetic studies of these families reveal unusual markers, DNA sequences that appear nowhere else in general human populations. Not mutations, not random variations, structured differences that suggest distinct ancestry. What if these families are not just wealthy? What if they are genetically distinct, carrying higher concentrations of Anunnaki DNA than average humans? That would explain their consistent success across generations. Not luck, not even just inherited wealth. Biological advantage, enhanced cognitive abilities, longer natural lifespans, neurological structures optimized for strategic thinking and pattern recognition. They are not like us. They are more like the Anunnaki. And their role might be to maintain control until their benefactors return, ensuring that humanity remains organized in ways that serve Anunnaki interests. These families meet regularly at events that exclude public scrutiny, Bilderberg Group meetings where global leaders and corporate executives discuss policy behind closed doors, the Bohemian Grove gatherings where political elites perform rituals that mock public religiosity, Davos forums where economic direction is coordinated among people who supposedly compete. These are not just networking events. They are coordination meetings for a management class that sees itself as fundamentally separate from the humans they govern. The symbolism is everywhere once you recognize the pattern. The all-seeing eye on the dollar bill, ancient symbol of Anunnaki surveillance, obelisks in major cities, echoes of Sumerian architecture marking territory, corporate logos incorporating pyramids, wings, serpents, all imagery connected to Anunnaki deities. This is not hidden. It is in plain sight, signals to those who know the real history that the old powers still hold influence. Technology companies are particularly interesting in this context. The sudden explosion of computing power, artificial intelligence, quantum systems, all developing faster than normal innovation cycles would predict. Where is this knowledge coming from? Are we really inventing it? Or are we being fed information, given technological breadcrumbs by watchers who need humanity at a certain capability level before the Anunnaki return? Silicon Valley's rapid ascension from garage startups to global dominance happened too quickly, too smoothly, as if guided by intelligence with a specific timeline. The space programs of private companies like SpaceX tell another story. Billionaires suddenly obsessed with Mars colonization, investing fortunes in getting humans off Earth. Why? Mars is a dead rock with minimal atmosphere and no magnetic field. Living there would be constant misery. Unless the goal is not really Mars, unless Mars is a cover story for developing the infrastructure to meet something arriving from the outer solar system. Launch platforms, heavy lift capability, orbital facilities, everything you would need to interact with incoming spacecraft. Not ours, theirs. Disclosure is accelerating. Government documents acknowledging unidentified aerial phenomena, videos from military pilots showing objects that defy known physics, mainstream media treating these topics seriously instead of dismissing them. This is not accidental. This is conditioning, preparing public consciousness for revelation. You do not suddenly admit that craft with capabilities beyond human technology regularly violate restricted airspace, unless you are preparing people for something bigger. The question is not whether disclosure will happen. The question is what will be disclosed, and whether the truth we are given is the actual truth or a managed version designed to prevent panic. Ancient astronaut theories entered mainstream conversation in the 1960s and 70s, precisely when space exploration was advancing rapidly. Was that timing coincidental? Or was it strategic, seeding ideas into public consciousness so that when the Anunnaki return, the concept is not completely shocking? Hollywood has been doing this work for decades, producing films and shows featuring ancient aliens, genetic engineering, returning gods. Entertainment, yes, but also preparation, soft disclosure wrapped in fiction. The convergence is accelerating, genetic engineering advancing, space programs expanding, secret facilities preparing, elite families consolidating power, ancient knowledge being suppressed or controlled, astronomical anomalies being tracked. All of it points towards something imminent, something that connects our present directly to that ancient past when gods walked among us. If the Anunnaki are returning, if NIBIRU's orbit is bringing them back into our neighborhood, the next few decades will determine humanity's future more than everything that happened in the last 6,000 years combined. Will we be slaves again? Will we fight for independence? Will the Watchers reveal themselves and help us prepare? Or will they ensure we remain ignorant and compliant, ready to resume our role as the genetically engineered workforce we were always designed to be? The conspiracy is not that powerful people coordinate to maintain control. The conspiracy is that the control system was established hundreds of thousands of years ago by beings who never left, who have been managing human development through proxies and bloodline agents this entire time. And now, as their superiors approach, as NIBIRU completes another orbit, as the return becomes inevitable, everything hidden is about to be revealed, whether we are ready or not. Let me show you something that should not exist. In 1929, a Turkish naval officer named Piri Reis found an old map while cataloguing the library of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The map was dated to 1513, supposedly compiled from even older source maps that Piri Reis claimed came from the time of Alexander the Great. Interesting, but not shocking until you actually look at what the map shows. It depicts the coastline of South America with remarkable accuracy for its supposed time period. It shows Antarctica, not just Antarctica as a vague landmass, but Antarctica with accurate coastal features. And here is the impossible part. It shows Antarctica without ice. The mountains, the bays, the rivers, all features that are currently buried under miles of ice and were not mapped by modern civilization until the 1950s using ground-penetrating radar and seismographic surveys. The last time Antarctica was ice-free was roughly 6,000 years ago, at minimum. So how did a map from 1513, based on sources supposedly from 300 BC, accurately depict geological features that should have been invisible for millennia? The mainstream explanation is that it is a coincidence, that the map is actually showing something else, and we are misinterpreting it. Except the mathematics do not lie. When you convert the Piri Reis map's projection and overlay it on modern satellite imagery, the correlation is undeniable. Someone mapped Antarctica from above, when it had no ice cover, using surveying techniques that required aerial perspective or satellite capability. Someone who was here before recorded history began. Then there is the Antikythera mechanism, pulled from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek coast in 1901. For decades, it sat in a museum, corroded and incomprehensible, until X-ray analysis in the 2000s revealed its internal structure. What researchers found inside the encrusted bronze casing was a device of staggering sophistication. A mechanical computer with over 30 interlocking gears, designed to calculate astronomical positions and predict eclipses decades in advance. The precision of the gear teeth is microscopic, requiring manufacturing capabilities that should not have existed for another 1,500 years. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the gear ratios demonstrates understanding of planetary motion that supposedly was not achieved until Copernicus and Kepler. And perhaps most disturbingly, the mechanism incorporates differential gearing, a technology that did not reappear in human civilization until the 18th century. Who built it? The device dates to approximately 100 BC, created in Greece during a period when the most advanced technology was supposed to be the lever and the pulley. But this was not primitive mechanics. This was precision engineering requiring mathematical knowledge, metallurgical expertise, and astronomical understanding that exceeds what ancient Greeks are credited with possessing, unless they did not invent it. Unless they inherited it from older sources, preserved knowledge from when the Anunnaki were still teaching humans, maintaining fragments of technology that would later be lost when civilizations collapsed. In Baghdad, in a 1936 excavation, German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig discovered something in the basement of the Iraq Museum that made no sense. Clay jars, roughly 2,000 years old, containing copper cylinders and iron rods, sealed with bitumen. When Koenig analyzed the construction, he realized these were galvanic cells, batteries, ancient batteries capable of generating electrical current. Replicas built following the original design produce approximately 1.1 volts. Not much power, but unmistakably electrical. Why would ancient people need batteries? The mainstream theory suggests electroplating, using electrical current to coat objects with thin layers of gold or silver. But electroplating requires not just batteries, but understanding of electrochemistry, knowledge of how electric current interacts with metallic solutions. That is not accidental discovery. That is applied science, the kind that requires a theoretical foundation and experimental methodology. What else were they powering? If you have batteries, you have portable electricity. You can create light sources for working in deep tunnels or sealed chambers. You can run tools that require electrical current. You can power devices that we would recognize as technology rather than primitive crafts. And if some ancient people had this capability, where did it come from? Not random innovation, knowledge transfer. Someone taught them. Someone with a reason to want humans developing specific technical capabilities. The crystal skulls scattered across museums and private collections present another enigma. These are life-sized human skulls carved from single pieces of quartz crystal, primarily found in Mesoamerica but with examples appearing in other regions. The most famous, the Mitchell-Hedges skull, was supposedly discovered in Belize in the 1920s. Hewlett-Packard Laboratories examined it in 1970 and determined that the skull was carved against the natural grain of the crystal, which should have shattered it during the manufacturing process. They concluded it would require over 300 years of continuous abrasion to create the skull using techniques available to pre-Columbian civilizations. But someone made it. The tool marks are microscopic, suggesting machinery rather than hand tools. The optical properties are extraordinary, with light channeling through the crystal in ways that create strange visual effects. Some researchers claim the skulls contain information encoded at the molecular level within the crystal structure, recoverable only with technology we are just beginning to develop. True or fantasy? Hard to say. But the skulls exist. They are real objects. And nobody can explain how they were manufactured using primitive technology. Then there are the Nazca lines in Peru, massive geoglyphs carved into the desert floor depicting animals, geometric shapes, and strange figures visible only from the air. Some of these designs stretch for hundreds of feet, requiring precise mathematical planning to create proportionally correct images at such scale. The lines were made by removing the dark surface rocks to reveal lighter soil underneath. A simple technique, but applied with extraordinary precision. Why create artwork that can only be appreciated from a vantage point that ancient peoples supposedly could not achieve? The patterns are invisible from ground level. You need to be hundreds of feet in the air to see them properly. So who were they made for? The gods, according to local tradition, beings who flew through the sky and needed landing markers or navigational guides. The Nazca lines are not art. They are infrastructure, runways and direction indicators for aerial craft, created by a civilization that was in regular contact with beings who traveled by air. Pumapunku in Bolivia might be the most disturbing ancient site on Earth. The stone blocks there are not just large, they are geometrically perfect, cut with laser precision, some weighing over 100 tons. The blocks feature interlocking joints that look like modern prefabricated construction, H-shaped channels and precise right angles that should be impossible to achieve with copper chisels and stone hammers. The tolerances are measured in fractions of millimeters. More strangely, some blocks show evidence of being poured rather than carved, as if the stone was somehow liquefied and molded into shape before hardening. Geopolymer theory suggests this might be possible using chemical processes to break down stone at the molecular level, but that requires sophisticated chemistry that supposedly did not exist in ancient Bolivia. Unless it did, unless someone taught them, unless the Anunnaki left behind not just knowledge but actual technology, tools and devices that allowed ancient humans to work stone in ways we cannot replicate today without modern machinery. Every continent has megalithic structures that challenge official narratives. Göbekli Tepe, in Turkey, built 11,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers who supposedly had no agriculture, no writing, no organizational structure capable of coordinating massive construction projects. Yet there it stands, astronomical observatory and ritual center predating Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Sacsayhuaman in Peru with its massive polygonal stones fitted together with no mortar, edges so tight you cannot insert a knife blade between them. The Longyu Caves in China, enormous underground chambers carved from solid rock, with no historical record of who made them or why. All of these sites share common features. Astronomical alignments indicating advanced understanding of celestial mechanics, engineering precision, exceeding what primitive tools should achieve. Construction scales requiring organization and labor forces that official history says did not exist. And most tellingly, they are all ancient, predating the civilizations that surrounded them, sitting there as monuments to a forgotten age when capabilities exceeded what we credit to those time periods. These are not mysteries in the sense of puzzles we might someday solve with enough research. These are contradictions. Physical evidence that our entire historical framework is incomplete or wrong. They are proof that advanced knowledge and capability existed in deep antiquity, then disappeared, then slowly rebuilt over millennia. They are scars on the landscape left by the Anunnaki presence, remnants of a time when gods walked the earth, and humans built according to divine specifications, using techniques taught by beings who understood principles we are only now rediscovering. The question is not whether these mysteries have answers. They do. The question is whether those answers will ever be officially acknowledged, or whether they will remain suppressed, controlled, kept hidden by institutions that recognize the danger in letting humanity remember its true past. Because once we remember, once we understand what we were and what was done to us, everything changes. And maybe that is exactly what they fear most. Let me be completely transparent with you. Mainstream science does not accept the Anunnaki theory, not even a little bit. Academia treats ancient astronaut theories with the same contempt it reserves for flat Earth conspiracy and homeopathy. If you are a researcher who publishes work supporting Anunnaki intervention in human development, your career is effectively over. Universities will not hire you. Journals will not publish your papers. Colleagues will mock you at conferences. The institutional pressure against this narrative is immense and deliberate. Why? The standard answer is that the evidence does not meet scientific standards. Archaeologists point out that Zecharia Sitchin, who popularized the Anunnaki theory in the 1970s, was not a trained archaeologist or linguist. His translations of Sumerian texts are disputed by experts who read cuneiform professionally. They claim he took creative liberties, interpreted ambiguous symbols to fit his predetermined conclusions, and ignored contradictory evidence. According to mainstream scholars, Sitchin saw what he wanted to see and built an elaborate mythology around mistranslations and misunderstandings. Fair criticism? Partially. Sitchin did make interpretive choices that professional Sumerologists disagree with. He did not have formal academic credentials in ancient languages. But here is the problem with dismissing him entirely. Many of his core claims about Sumerian cosmology and history are verifiable in the original texts, even when you consult mainstream translations. The Sumerians did describe beings coming from the sky. They did claim that kingship descended from heaven after a great flood. They did possess astronomical knowledge that should have been impossible for their supposed technological level. You cannot hand-wave away those facts by attacking Sitchin's credentials. Either the Sumerian texts say what they appear to say, or we need a better explanation for why ancient people consistently described encounters with technologically advanced beings. Mainstream archaeology does not provide that explanation. Instead, it labels everything as mythology and moves on, refusing to engage with the implications of what ancient people actually claimed happened. The genetic evidence is similarly contested. Yes, there are gaps in the human evolutionary timeline that conventional models struggle to explain. The sudden appearance of anatomically modern humans roughly 300,000 years ago, followed by 250,000 years of behavioral stagnation, then an explosive cultural revolution 50,000 years ago. This pattern is weird. It does not fit gradual evolutionary development. Something happened to trigger rapid cognitive advancement, and mainstream science admits it does not fully understand what. But does that mean genetic engineering by aliens? Critics argue that we simply have not found the transitional fossils yet, that the archaeological record is incomplete, that cognitive abilities leave no physical traces, so the lack of evidence for cultural complexity does not prove it did not exist. These are reasonable counter-arguments. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we have not found the smoking gun does not mean we can leap to extraterrestrial intervention. However, mainstream explanations have their own holes. The mitochondrial Eve hypothesis, which traces all modern humans to a single female ancestor who lived roughly 200,000 years ago, is accepted science. But it also suggests a dramatic population bottleneck, a reduction to a very small breeding population that then explosively expanded. What caused that bottleneck? Climate change? Disease? Or something else? Something like the flood described in ancient texts, an event that nearly wiped out humanity before we rebuilt from survivors carrying specific genetic traits. The technological anomalies present a stronger challenge to skeptics. The Antikythera mechanism exists. It is sitting in a museum. You can examine it yourself. And there is no conventional explanation for how Greeks in 100 BC possessed the metallurgical precision and astronomical knowledge to build it. Mainstream archaeology essentially shrugs and suggests it was a one-off genius invention that did not spread because the knowledge was lost. But that is not an explanation. That is admitting you do not have an explanation and hoping nobody notices. The same goes for the precision stonework at Pumapunku, the impossible accuracy of the Piri Reis map, the Baghdad batteries, the crystal skulls. Mainstream science either ignores these artifacts or offers explanations so convoluted that they require more faith than the alternative theory. Yes, it is possible that ancient people developed lost techniques that allowed them to achieve precision we cannot replicate today with modern tools. But it is also possible, maybe more possible, that they had help. The real issue is not the evidence. The issue is the framework. Science operates within a paradigm, a set of assumptions about how the world works. When evidence appears that contradicts the paradigm, the natural response is to dismiss or reinterpret that evidence rather than question the paradigm itself. Accepting the Anunnaki theory would require abandoning foundational assumptions about human history, evolution, and the development of civilization. It would invalidate thousands of academic papers, countless textbooks, entire careers built on models that would suddenly be wrong. That creates institutional inertia. Even if individual scientists privately acknowledge that conventional explanations are inadequate, they cannot publicly support alternative theories without professional suicide. So they remain silent, or they offer weak critiques while secretly suspecting there might be something to the ancient astronaut hypothesis. The evidence keeps accumulating. The anomalies keep appearing. But the official narrative remains unchanged because too many people have too much invested in maintaining it. Yet some things the skeptics get right. Not every ancient structure was built by aliens. Not every myth describes literal historical events. Human capability is often underestimated by ancient astronaut theorists, who cannot imagine how primitive people achieved impressive results. Sometimes the answer really is patience, ingenuity, and lots of manual labor. The danger of the Anunnaki theory is that it can become a catch-all explanation that prevents genuine investigation into human achievement. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Humans are capable of extraordinary things when properly motivated, but we also received help, guidance, maybe direct intervention at key points in our development. The question is not whether we built pyramids or whether aliens did. The question is whether we built them alone, or with knowledge and possibly technology provided by beings who were here before civilization began. That is a more nuanced position, harder to prove or disprove, but probably closer to the reality of what actually happened. Science will eventually catch up. As genetic techniques improve, as archaeological methods advance, as more sites are excavated and more texts translated, the evidence will become undeniable. We are already seeing this in small ways. Mainstream acceptance of catastrophic climate events in prehistory, acknowledgement of advanced ancient astronomy, admission that conventional timelines might be wrong. Slowly, grudgingly, the paradigm is shifting. The question is whether it shifts fast enough to prepare humanity for what happens when the Anunnaki return, or whether we will still be arguing about translation methodology when their ships appear in our skies. So here we are, at the end of 3 hours together, and you probably have more questions now than when we started. That is good. Questions are how we break through the carefully constructed narratives that have controlled human consciousness for millennia. Questions are dangerous to power structures built on unexamined assumptions. And the biggest question facing humanity right now is this: what do we do with the possibility that everything we thought we knew about ourselves is wrong? Let me lay out 3 scenarios for you, 3 possible realities we might be living in, and you can decide which one makes the most sense based on everything we have discussed. Scenario 1. The Anunnaki theory is completely false. Ancient astronauts never visited Earth. Humans evolved naturally through random mutation and selection pressure over millions of years. Civilization developed organically as hunter-gatherers discovered agriculture and slowly built complexity over thousands of years. The Sumerian texts are mythology, mistranslated and misunderstood by enthusiastic amateurs. The technological anomalies have conventional explanations that we simply have not figured out yet. The genetic gaps will be filled when we find more fossils. Everything mainstream science tells us is basically correct, and people like Sitchin were either deluded or deliberately misleading the public for profit. If this is true, then we owe our existence to nothing but cosmic accident and geological time. We are alone in the universe, or at least alone in our development, with no parents or creators except the blind processes of evolution. Our future is entirely in our hands, shaped only by our choices and natural forces. That is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because we have no backup, no cosmic parents to save us if we destroy ourselves. Liberating because we owe nothing to anyone, and our destiny is purely self-determined. Scenario 2. The Anunnaki theory contains partial truth mixed with speculation and error. Advanced beings did visit Earth in deep prehistory, and interacted with early humans in ways that influenced our development. They might have provided knowledge that accelerated civilization. They might have conducted genetic experiments that altered human evolution. But the specific details, as presented in ancient texts and modern interpretations, are exaggerated, mythologized, or misunderstood. The core insight is correct. We are not entirely natural products of this planet, but the specifics are murky and probably unknowable, given current evidence. If this scenario is accurate, then we are hybrid beings, part natural evolution and part deliberate intervention. We carry within us the potential of both our terrestrial origins and whatever extraterrestrial influence shaped us. Our future involves discovering and integrating both aspects of our nature, understanding that we are simultaneously of Earth and beyond it. This is the most complex scenario psychologically, because it requires holding contradictory truths in tension. We are both slaves and free, both designed and self-determining, both abandoned and watched over. Scenario 3. The Anunnaki theory is substantially accurate. We were created through genetic engineering by beings from NIBIRU who came to Earth seeking resources. We served as their workforce for hundreds of thousands of years. They departed roughly 2,000 years ago, but left behind control structures and monitoring systems to manage our development during their absence. They are returning soon, possibly within our lifetimes, as NIBIRU completes its orbital cycle. The bloodline families that control global power structures are their agents, preparing humanity for reintegration into the Anunnaki system. Everything happening in current events, technological acceleration, genetic engineering, space programs, social upheaval is orchestrated preparation for this return. If Scenario 3 is the reality we inhabit, then humanity faces an existential decision in the very near future. When our creators return, do we submit as we did for millennia before, accepting our role as the designed workforce serving masters with superior technology? Or do we resist, assert our independence, demand recognition as a sovereign species with rights to our own world regardless of who engineered our DNA? That decision has profound implications. Submission might mean survival, but at the cost of freedom, autonomy, and self-determination. We would be pets, perhaps well treated but ultimately controlled. Resistance might mean destruction, because if the Anunnaki view us as property and we refuse to comply, they have the technology to enforce their will or eliminate us entirely. Is principled freedom worth extinction? Is comfortable servitude preferable to risky independence? But maybe there is a fourth option, one the ancient texts hint at but never fully articulate. Maybe enough has changed in the millennia of Anunnaki absence that the old rules no longer apply. We are not the primitive workers they left behind. We have developed technology, built civilizations, explored space, split the atom, mapped the genome. We are not their equals yet, but we are not helpless either. Maybe, just maybe, we can negotiate a different relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than domination and submission. For that to work, we would need unity. Humanity would have to stop fighting itself long enough to present a united front. That might be the hardest part because we have been divided by design, separated into competing nations, religions, ideologies that keep us weak and manageable. Breaking through those divisions to achieve global human solidarity would require overcoming programming that has been embedded in our civilizations for thousands of years. Possible? Maybe. Likely? That depends on us. The evidence we have explored over the past 2 hours does not prove any scenario absolutely, but it does prove that official narratives are incomplete at best and deliberately deceptive at worst. The artifacts exist, the texts exist, the genetic anomalies exist, the technological impossibilities exist. Something happened in human prehistory that we have not been told about, and the suppression of that knowledge is ongoing and intentional. What you do with this information is your choice. You can dismiss it, return to comfortable conventional beliefs, trust that authorities have your best interests at heart. That is the easy path, the one most people will take. Or you can keep questioning, keep investigating, keep pushing against the boundaries of acceptable inquiry. That is the hard path, the one that leads to uncomfortable truths and difficult decisions. But here is what I know for certain. The world is changing faster than at any point in recorded history. Technology is advancing at exponential rates. Power structures are shifting. Old certainties are collapsing. Something is coming. Whether that something is the return of the Anunnaki, first contact with other intelligences, or simply humanity reaching a developmental threshold that changes everything. We are approaching a point of no return, a moment when the trajectory of human civilization will be determined for millennia to come. Where do we stand? On the edge, on the precipice between one age and another, between ignorance and knowledge, between slavery and freedom, between extinction and transcendence. The choice of which direction we go might not be entirely ours to make, but how we respond to what happens next absolutely is. So stay curious, stay critical, question everything, including what I have told you today. Do your own research. Look at the primary sources. Examine the evidence with your own eyes. And when the moment comes, when the truth can no longer be hidden, and we collectively face the reality of who we are and where we came from, to be ready to make the choice that determines not just your future, but the future of our entire species. The gods are coming back. The only question is whether we will greet them as slaves welcoming our masters home, or as free beings defending the world we have built in their absence. That decision starts now, with you, with the choice to see clearly despite the fog of misdirection that has obscured our vision for so long. The Anunnaki gave us life, but what we do with that life, who we choose to become, that is ours to determine. And that might be the most terrifying and exhilarating truth of all. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Now go and decide for yourself what you believe. Just remember, once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And what you choose to do with that sight will define who you are when the return finally happens. Be ready. One more thing. NASA just announced they found something at the edge of our solar system. They are calling it an anomaly. Check the date of that announcement. Then check the Sumerian calculations for NIBIRU's return. I will let you do the math. Before you go, do me a favor. Re-watch from minute 43. Listen to what I said about the bloodlines. Then look up the family trees of the people currently in power. You will see it. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And when NIBIRU appears in our telescopes officially this time, remember you heard it here first. Stay vigilant.